Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. If you're searching for an incredible novel, check out my Patreon page. Your support will help transform this story into an exciting audiobook. Join me on this adventure. By becoming a Patreon member, you'll be helping me keep creating and bringing this content to life. Thank you for being part of the journey.
Chapter 21. Skills. After not being able to catch a single Shinhu and losing the match, both Dorsey and Anak paid up their respective sums, leading to Winston's total profits reaching 7,600. Man, that was exhausting. Amon huffed as he sat down on one of the chairs of Winston's room. Winston smiled at him. Zarin sat cross-legged on his bed, greedily eating every fruit he could spot in the room. The scout teacher is a weird man, he lamented. Why? Winston asked, intrigued. How should I say this? He's too petty. Amon scratched his chin. He doesn't like losing. Even on the first day, he didn't hold back at all. Winston chuckled. What about you, Zarin? Winston spoke. Zarin gazed at him from the corner of his eyes, chewing on an apple. We didn't do too much today. They taught us to use the spear. Something I already know since childhood, he said offhandedly. But what's the teacher like? Amon asked with interest. He's all right, I guess. Zarin didn't show any enthusiasm. Amon turned his eyes towards Winston. What about you, Mr. Winston? What did you do today? We practiced how to use the real inventory today. Winston adorned a toothy grin. They talked some more inside his room, discussing various topics related to the teachers, the skills that would be taught to the different positions and so on and so forth. Without realizing it, dinner time arrived quite quickly. Amon, followed by Winston and Zarin, opened the gates to the cafeteria. As they stepped into the hall, Winston immediately noticed all the regulars having been seated, with the exception of a few. Turning his head, Winston noticed Kun, Rack and Dorsey standing in the line to the counter, with Dorsey at the last spot right after Kun. Without further ado, they also joined the line to get their food. Feeling especially happy today, Winston had decided to eat well and enjoy his bumper harvest. Another thing that Winston had to mention was the fact that his swindler potion was somewhat stimulated upon getting the points into his pocket, which, for him, came as a surprise. The deal he had made was a genuine match with stakes on each side. It was devoid of any deception on his side, yet it still somehow stimulated the potion digestion to a small degree. Well, if I actually used deception, then the potion might have digested further. Winston clicked his tongue, feeling a bit regretful at the mixed opportunity. After getting their plates, they sat down onto the table. His own seat, as Winston noticed, was quite close to where Dorsey had been sitting. Winston looked at his extremely lavish plate of food, worth a whole 600 points. He could feel Dorsey's slightly annoyed glare at the side of his head, along with both Amon and Zarin's tantalized eyes. Winston rolled an eye at their antics and invited them for eating. Shortly after they sat down, Shibisu and his team came to the cafeteria. Shibisu and Hats were also in the same class as Amon, while Anak quietly chose to glare at him, eventually resulting in them sitting all very close to each other and talking along about various random subjects, including but not limited to, the scenery around the mothership, the unfair pricing on higher grade pockets, wanting to go sightseeing, etc. Anak glared at both Winston and Dorsey, who was seated some distance from them for the entire time. After having eaten his fill, Winston returned to his room to sleep for the night. The next day, Winston again stood amid the giant stone pillars of the Fisherman training field. Today, we will be learning about body strengthening, Hex exclaimed, overlooking all the regulars. Winston smiled in anticipation. He had managed to figure out body strengthening and flow control by his own accord one night prior. However, it was still mostly unrefined and lacking finesse. Winston looked forward to further observing the skill behind body strengthening and integrating it to his own skill set. Body strengthening is another crucial ability to have for any fisherman. Save for rankers and higher rank regulars, whose physical capabilities have been enhanced through the shinsu pressures of the upper floors of the tower, the natural physical ability of the people can't be used to fight extensively. The ranker continued. Shinsu body strengthening can allow your bodies to transcend their current limits, allowing you to jump extreme distances, pierce through stone and endure crushing blows. As Winston calmly observed the ranker with his spirit vision, he felt her shinsu fasten up inside her body, a direct application of flow control. Without any weight, she immediately descended from the sky to land on the middle pillar. As she landed, she spoke up again. Body strengthening is performed through applications of flow control. Shinsu flows through every being in the tower. If that flow inside of your body or even specific parts of your body can be strengthened and made quicker, it bolsters your body through it. She held up her fist and punched down onto the ground. Bomb! Cracks spread like spiderwebs from the place of impact, diverging from her fist that was embedded into the pillar. This right here is me using just a tiny bit of Shinsu strengthening. With complete strengthening, I could take apart this entire testing zone in just 2 minutes, she exclaimed. Winston looked on with unconcealed interest, intently looking at the way the Shinsu was flowing through her. Flow control through one's own body is largely easier than controlling it outside. As such, most regulars pick it up within 2 weeks of practice, she said. Winston smiled hearing her words. Since he had already displayed qualities of being able to generate a bong without too much trouble, he had no reason to hide his speed of learning here. He could openly showcase his talent and learn body strengthening at his own pace. He locked his hand and stretched them above his head. I do think I'll enjoy learning the applications of Shinsu, he thought, a curious glint in his eyes. A large valley stretched out between the mountains, the abyss-like drop shadowed by mist and fog. The sun shone down, its light deflecting and scattering into a glorious rainbow somewhere down the valley. The shadows of the mountains stretched out across the valley, overshadowing a cliffside into a bit of shade. Many people stood atop the cliff, creatures of various sizes and shapes, some gigantic while others appearing more normal. The only similarity between all of them were the spears each of them held, blood red in color. It was the training ground for the spear bearers. All the regulars looked on towards a lone man seated atop a large stone. The man wore a white lab coat with black pants. He had a dark complexion with light hair, somewhat yellowish in color. It was the spear bearer's teacher, Bok Dol-yu. The first day I taught you how to contract, he chimed. The second day I taught you how to use spears. I'm a simple man, so let's put an end to the basics, he said. Hearing his words, the regulars grew restless. Zarin smiled, eager to practice with his spear. Today, let's try something more fun, he smirked. Jumping off the rock, he walked to the edge of the cliff. And that fun thing will be to hit a really close target. As he walked to the edge, he pointed out with his hand. There, floating in the air about 300 meters from the cliff was a circular target board, appearing wooden in nature. Regulars. Do you see that target? He asked. The regulars looked on, one squinting his eyes to find the target. Close, you say? The regular said. Now each and every one of you will come forward to try and hit the target. Sound fun, right? Oh, and one more thing. The ranker broke out with a devious grin. Anyone that can hit that target within the next 4 days will pass without any other questions, he declared. A wave of shock traveled through every regulars present. That jerk. He's doing this on purpose. One of the regulars, green in color, said in annoyance. He clearly hasn't taught us enough for us to do that. The regulars beside him nodded in agreement. Finally. Suddenly, a boisterous voice came crashing down into everyone's ears. Then, a crocodilian creature stepped forward. A genius like me should pass the test before everyone, Rak declared egoistically. What? Are you saying you can pass the test? The green-skinned regular, Pericule by name, spoke, enraged. Rak huffed, ignoring them. Then, he walked to the cliff and threw his spear with all he could muster. Raya-ha-ha! He yelled. The spear flew like a rocket, traveling 150 meters without trouble, and then cascaded down towards the abyss. Rak's eyes widened as he heard the laughing voices of the other regulars, Pericule in particular. This can't be, he said. Ha! You're obviously not cut out for the task, you crocodile. Zarin chimed from the side, rolling his eyes at the gigantic crocodile. Ha! Rak screamed. Without saying anything, Zarin walked towards the edge and fired his spear. Ora-ea-wa-ea! He yelled. The spear traveled for 130 meters without issue and cascaded down into the abyss. Silence! There was silence in the training ground for a moment, before the boisterous laughter of Rak rang out. Bwahahahaha! Look at you! Ha 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 ha! Acting all high and stuff. Rak laughed in a great voice. You're just a turtle. Ha 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 ha! Zarin gnashed his teeth in annoyance. What? You wanna fight me? You croc! He yelled, balling his fists. Ho! Are you sure? Rak exclaimed too. Just then, something passed right over their heads like a bullet. Swoosh! They looked towards the source, seeing a spear going right through the target, breaking it apart like glass. Both of their eyes widened in surprise. They turned almost mechanically towards the one that had thrown the spear. There was a towering behemoth covered in a dark brown robe, his face too veiled by a demonic mask with horrifying teeth. It was the regular that came along with the team from the other testing site, going only by the name, Ghost. Rak and Zahan's eyes narrowed with competitive spirit, standing upright towards the behemoth-like figure that towered over even Rak by 3 whole heads worth of height. A smile blossomed on Zaran and Rak's faces. Chapter 22. Family Drama. In my dream, I was running. Tap 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 tap. I don't quite remember exactly what it was that followed me. Neither do I remember if I was following behind something. I remember being somewhere dark, a lonely place. It was cold, so cold I felt as if my legs would freeze off. I built a large mountain out of stones, something that could reach above to a ceiling. Smash. Smash. It could never break through the barrier, no matter how much I smashed it with a stone, no matter how much I tried to go through it. Huff. Huff. I laid there, crying on the hill of stone I had built, laying in darkness alone. And then something broke through. Are you okay? She taught me everything I knew. Language, behavior, feelings. Sometimes she would tell me stories. Glorious stories that spoke of a great tower, incomprehensible in size and scale, tales of great heroes that climbed the tower. She sometimes told me the stories about the sky and the stars. Bam! Do you know what's at the top of the tower? I don't care. I had said. You don't have any goals. At the top of the tower, there is something called the sky. Sky? What's that? Lie down. Okay. Now close your eyes. I closed them. And imagine. The rocks above us are all gone. Gone? Then what's left? Nothing. Nothing? Yes. There's nothing blocking us now. There's a wide sky all above us. And at night, thousands of stars glitter in the sky. One day, I will go there for sure. I couldn't speak anything. Something blocked my throat. I didn't know what to say. Rachel. Stop saying silly things. Okay. Bam's body moved beneath the sheets, his eyes fluttering. Don't go. Don't go, Rachel. He muttered. Kun, who sat close to him, stood up in surprise. Bam. Are you awake? Rak also sat right beside Kun, eating all banana without a care. What happened? Bam tried to get up, but Kun pushed him back down, seeing his sluggish movements. You've been unconscious for the past 5 days, Kun said with a deadpan. Crocodile thought you were dead, he said. What? 5 days. Bam exclaimed. What about the test? The test had already begun 2 days ago. Kun sighed. Then, did I fail the test? Bam asked, his pupils shaking in nervousness. Well, Kun droned on. You didn't fail, turtle. Rak said from the side, taking a bite from a banana. Don't you have any sense of mystery? Kun yelled at him. Bam heaved a sigh of relief hearing his words. But, how? Wel. Kun proceeded to tell him about the way the positioning test was to be conducted, along with the fact that the wave controller teacher was to arrive 3 days late. So, your side of the test will start tomorrow. I was almost afraid that you weren't going to wake up. Kun smiled, heaving a sigh of relief. You were lucky. The other positions have already been through 2 classes. If you missed out on any of them, you would have lost a lot of points. Phew, that's a relief. Bam breathed out again. Yeah. Wave controller might be hard, but it's good anyway. Bam's expression turned a bit thoughtful. Mr. Kun. He called out, prompting Kun to look at him. What about, how's Rachel? He asked. Kun's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. Oh? You mean that yellow-haired girl? Seeing Bam nod, he continued. She's fine. She even came to see you. Bam's eyes lit up in excitement and happiness. However, Kun said before Bam could say anything. Bam. She isn't who you thought she was. She doesn't know you, she even said that as she looked right at you. Bam's eyes turned confused. You might have been confused, that happens. Kun explained. With that, Kun adorned a cheerful smile on his face. But look on the bright side, I'm sure you'll find her somewhere along the way of climbing the tower. See, I even got you this super rare regular uniform from the Evankel store. Even a headband too. He exclaimed. At that moment, Rak, who had stayed quietly beside him, got up. I've decided. He yelled. Kun and Bam turned to him in surprise. What happened? Kun asked. I'm going back to the wild. Don't stop me, turtle. He yelled and dashed out of the room right through the door. Kun and Bam stared at the exit for a couple of seconds before breaking out into a small fit of laughter. Then, Bam stopped and squeezed the sheets that covered him. Rachel. He muttered to himself. Winston stared at the small slip before him, his eyes turning to look up at Amon, who smiled awkwardly at him. There was a small tug on Winston's lips, amused at the variety of tasks each position received. Make 10 friends, huh? That surely ought to be a daunting task. Winston also looked over towards Hats and Shibisu, who followed along. Yeah, it's pretty strange. We've been failing constantly due to Hats's terrible personality. Shibisu admitted without shame. My personality? It's their fault for being so insufferable without a hint of warrior spirit. Hats huffed in annoyance, clicking his tongue as he did so. Warrior spirit? Winston looked at him with interest. Well, I can certainly see how he would spell trouble with some of the regulars. If not most. Winston admitted. Right. Amon and Shibisu said simultaneously. Well, all right. I'll be your friend. Winston nodded without batting an eye. Really? Shibisu yelled, turning to Hats and hugging him. We finally made a friend. Thank you. Hats bowed while pushing Shibisu away. Winston smiled. Don't sweat it too much. He shook his head and signed each of their lists. They couldn't sign each other's lists as the task was to specifically make friends out of the other positions. And with that, Winston became friends with Shibisu and Hats. The next day came quickly. Everyone gathered in the cafeteria to eat, standing in the line for the food counter. As Winston walked through the door, immediately he noticed Amon, Shibisu and Hats sitting on one of the tables. Along with that, he noticed the blue-haired Kun and Bam standing in lane. Winston smiled, pleasantly surprised that the boy had woken up. Without a worry, Winston walked towards them, getting into the line. Kun noticed him approaching from the back and greeted. Good morning. He smiled. Winston nodded in response. Good morning. Bam also realized his presence and turned around to greet him. So you're awake now, huh? Is your head injury fine? Winston asked. Bam nodded with an embarrassed smile. Actually, it still hurts a bit. Winston chuckled. Well, I guess blocking a metal rod with your head isn't exactly great for your health. Bam laughed and Kun simply gave a smile. I heard you guys also became friends with Shibisu, Hats and Amon. That's right. If possible, I wish to make many friends while I'm here. Bam expressed. Well, they're annoying but manageable. Kun said tersely. As their turn came, Winston looked over at Endorsi who stood before Bam and Kun in the line. One bibimbap without any meat, she said. At that moment, her attention was drawn to the talkative table at which Shibisu and Hats were seated along with a variety of other regulars. I already have 10 on my list. Shibisu boasted. How did you manage to get all of them? Did you bribe them? One of the scouts yelled. Then, Lore who was seated with them spoke. Don't forget to buy me some food tonight, Shibisu. He lazily spoke. The table continued into talking and discussing random topics. They're hanging out a lot lately. Is it okay for the rivals to be hanging out together? She thought with a thoughtful expression. Then, she shook her head. Kun came from behind and ordered 1 bibimbap and 1 egg hamlet. Along with that, Winston also gave his own. A bibimbap for me as well. As they got their orders, they went ahead and got seated with their group. Winston noticed that at some point, Endorsi had also slipped into their table, sitting between Bam and Hats. The group talked about how Amon and Hats still had 1 and 2 friends left to get onto their lists, respectively. Bam expressed his willingness to go along with them to become friends. At that moment, Bam called out to Endorsi. Miss Endorsi, why don't you become friends with Mr. Amon and Mr. Hats? He smiled. Endorsi looked at both Amon and Hats who sat on the table. What? Are you trying to set me up on a date? Endorsi's eyes overtook a seductive and mischievous glint. Well, they're certainly quite cute. This one can even be called a bit handsome. Endorsi said, turning to Hats, who in turn turned his head away from her direction. Yeah, he's super muscular as well. Bam exclaimed. Bam. It seems as if you're selling a shady products. Shibisu droned from the side. Endorsi smiled sweetly. Sorry but no. She said. But why? Bam asked. Bam, I'm not allowed to date. As her words landed, a confused stare followed along from Bam and a couple of other people on the table. Winston shook his head, realizing where this conversation was heading. It seemed that most people on the test floor did not yet realize that they were taking the tests with not 1, but 2 princesses of Jihad. And well, it was common knowledge that a princess was not allowed to date anyone, lest the power of Jihad were to spread. Really? That's one dismal household. Bam spoke. Right? But can't do anything about it. My father loves his daughters too much. Endorsi smiled cheerily. But isn't it okay to be friends? He asked with some hope. Winston didn't feel like stopping the conversation or taking any part in it. Well, I just don't believe in platonic relationships. I don't believe the fact that a man and a woman can just be friends. She expressed her belief. Then, she turned to Bam and spoke. To put it simply, it's like buying shoes that you really like, but then you put them on display without ever wearing them or taking them off. Bam gave her a puzzled look. That sounds complicated. Before the conversation could progress further, someone called out from behind Indorsey. What are you doing here? The voice said. Indorsey and Bam, alongside everyone on the table save for Winston, turned to look at the speaker. There, finding the green-skinned lizard girl, Anak Jihad. Having fun with these guys. Shame on a princess of Jihad, she said, walking past Indorsey and sitting beside Shibisu, who was at the far end of the table. With that, there was an uproar on the table. Indorsey sighed. Jihad? There are 2 princesses here? Regulars on the table exclaimed. Jihad? Does that mean you and Anak are related? Bam asked her. Indorsey smiled. Well, we're stepsisters, I guess. She stole a glance at Anak, who had started eating. You could say that we're luxury shoes put on display on the same shop window. The finest collection. She chuckled. Winston looked at her from the corner of his eyes, clearly understanding the metaphor with the shoes. He smiled. Chapter 23. Fisherman Battles. After eating their fill, the fisherman class commenced. Like always, Hex floated silently in the sky, mounted atop her strange mount that resembled a conch shell than any traditional mount. Welcome all regulars that have made their way into the fisherman class. Her voice boomed out, feeling especially strong and vigorous compared to her previous 2 classes. Today, let's go a small test instead of a normal class. She continued. The aim of this test is to be the last one standing. Starting now, you will all jump from pillar to pillar and make others fall off until there's only 8 regulars left standing. The only weapon you may use is the needle I have given you, and the results of this test will have big results on the final assessment. Winston looked at the blood-red needle that he and every other regular held in their hands. Any questions? Hex asked. Indorsey raised her hand on the far pillar. I have one. People could easily die if they fall from this place. So is there any protection? Indorsey asked. Hex nodded. There is some protection, but it's not too great. In fact, you could still injure yourself quite badly if you fall from the pillar, which would mean that you wouldn't be able to take the next tests and be at a disadvantage in the final assessment. Hearing her words, all the regulars' sweat dropped. They're being more cautious now that they know serious injuries are possible. Winston smiled and shook his head. Winston looked around and gauged the other regulars. There aren't many that can jump the gap through sheer physical capacity. And Shinsu body strengthening was only taught yesterday, meaning none of the regulars pose too much of a threat. As of now, only the princess duo can really pose a serious challenge, and even those can be defeated using all the collection of my Beyonder powers. Winston scratched his chin in contemplation. But even for them, attacking me wouldn't be a wise idea. Passing the test requires 8 lasting candidates, and failing can have large repercussions. However, just then, a vision overlapped his senses. He saw himself get kicked forward by something that came crashing down towards him from the sky, a humanoid figure Drapek in orange. Winston's body tightened and he leaned back almost 130 degrees. Something passed above him, spreading along with it a gust of sharp wind that whistled in his ears. The object landed onto the ground right before him, smashing right at the pillar surface and kicking up some dust. Snapping back into standing position, Winston eyed the perpetrator warily, seeing someone he wasn't quite expecting to see in the competition. What do I owe the pleasure, princess? Winston smirked, seeing Indorsey walk out of the dust. I just saw someone familiar heading towards you. So I decided to give you a heads up. Understanding what she meant, Winston turned around, seeing a green-skinned girl jump across the pillars and land on his own. Winston's smile widened. Oh my, isn't this quite unfair? He eyed the 2 princesses. Really? I don't think so. After all, it's a 3-way battle. Indorsey smirked. Then, she turned towards Anak. Is your IQ that of a lizard too? You would challenge me? A princess of Jihad? She asked. Anak scowled. I'm specifically targeting you because you are a princess. Having said that, Anak jumped into the air, leaping a whole 20 meters without too much effort. Then, with a swing of her hand she thrusted the needle towards Indorsey, only to hit empty air. Whoosh! Indorsey jumped back at the last moment, appearing some distance away from her. Every time I see that symbol of Jihad on your head, Anak smirked. I just want to break you to pieces. Anak turned back and glared at Winston, her empty eyes appearing especially threatening. Hey you! I'll deal with you afterwards. Stay there like a good boy. Her tone was transcendentally cold and unfeeling, almost appearing dead. Winston sighed. You're all so full of yourselves. He scratched his head. Blah blah blah, droning on and on about jihad and being a princess or whatnot. You seem like a couple of kids that have been granted power they can't control. For the first time, a glare appeared on Winston's face, his muscular control making his eyes appearing especially frightening. His muscles tightened up like a stressed string. You call each other fake, but is there even a real princess of jihad? Having said that, Winston felt their emotions towards him turn chaotic, especially in Dorsey. Winston sighed. Your skills are so lackluster, yet you claim to be some sort of big shot. Should I be humbled in your presence? Oh please. It seems the criteria for choosing the princess has really eased their requirements for people like you to become princesses. And that was the last straw. Dorsey and Anak dashed at him, their needles in position for a horrifying thrust that would pierce his entrails and render him a vegetable. In both of their eyes, wrath lurked in such a primal form that it was even hard to describe. Such malevolence, such intentions of evil. Were they in a single evil being, then such an evil villain had never went unhung and his neck had never went clean. This was beyond simple meanness, for that could be found in the smallest of creatures. This was something different. Pure desire to hurt the other party. Anak thrusted with her needle, aiming for his abdomen. Winston turned his body, seemingly at an impossible degree, and kicked out with his left leg, hitting her right in the face. His leg caused a small sonic boom to appear as he kicked out, and Anak was thrown out directly. Wham! Crash! Dorsey circled around him and quickly engaged into a fist fight with him. Winston smirked at having found a great outlet for his abilities. A flurry of attacks followed through from both the sides, each hitting several times a second, their needles, fists and kicks being deflected. With the body control of a clown, dexterity increase from the error pathway sequence 9 and 8 and the full pathway sequence 8, coupled with the strength increase of his potions, each of his attacks left small sonic booms in their wake. Winston had, at one point, felt that his strength might be the equivalent of a sequence 9 of the red praised pathway, Hunter, who could also punch with a sonic boom. Dorsey, contrary to what he had previously imagined, turned out to be somewhat of a competent fighter. She seemed to have some sort of a danger sense, or something close to that at the very least. Her strength seems to be just a level above that of Anak's, though I can't say for sure. All I have to work with is the one kick I gave her in the face. Just as he was thinking, he felt something approaching from behind. Without any weight, he jumped into the air, right onto another pillar. Looking back, he saw the two step-sisters engaging in a battle, their needles ruthlessly stabbing out at each other. Then, Dorsey jumped towards his pillar. Winston looked towards the previous occupant of the pillar, feeling somewhat sorry for the man. Boom! Crash! Wham! Shahia! They jumped across from pillar to pillar, trapped in a three-way lock, their needles blazing towards each other with dozens of kick and punches being thrown. With his sense of intuition, none of the attacks were able to hit Winston at all, simply brushing past him or being avoided altogether. Many of the regulars fell as they moved across the arena, clashing from pillar to pillar in a constant state of frenzy. It was the first time since arriving in the tower, save for the time with the white steel eel, that Winston was actively engaging himself in a somewhat engaging fight. A smirk marred his face as he dodged through the attacks and hit the princesses with a punch to the gut, or perhaps a kick to the face. All this while, they grew increasingly angry. Dorsey's eyes even flashed a bit of red, a large streak of red across her cheeks from her anger. Damn it! Anak yelled. Why can't I hit you? Stay still. Dorsey yelled alongside her. Winston smirked. I don't know, man. Sounds a bit like skill issue. Indeed. Winston was also well suited for a beyonder of the Red Priest pathway. Both of their faces flashed redder, appearing more like the faces of two demons than the young girls that they looked to be before. Their attacks sped up, loosing their small amounts of finesse that they still had going for them. Seizing control of the opportunity, Winston ducked, avoiding the needle that brushed past his hair. Then, he embedded his palm right into Anak's stomach, causing her to spit her saliva. Alworf! Anak flew backwards, her figure crashing right into another pillar. Then, before Dorsey could get the chance to react, he punched towards her face. Dorsey, in a surprising burst of speed, blocked his blow with her arms, and just like Anak, she slipped backwards. Org! What is that abnormal strength? She complained. Does it befit a princess to whine like that when you meet someone stronger? Winston raised a brow, chuckling as he did so. You've grown too accustomed to fighting weaker opponents, it seems. You are unable to even cope up with the fact that someone might be stronger than you. He shook his head. Dorsey clenched the needle in her hand. Then, she pointed it towards him. You? She said. Winston didn't say anything, simply smiling. Before Indorsey could reply, they heard someone behind them speak up. "Oi!" Anak yelled from the edge of the pillar. Winston ignored her, opting to take a look over towards the regulars. There were a total of 9 regulars still left, meaning one had be thrown down still. "Physically stronger, you said?" Anak yelled this time. Winston looked at her with a raised eyebrow. He tapped his thumb and ring finger together twice, activating his spirit vision. However, as he did so, his eyes widened in surprise and a massive smile adorned his face. "Shinsu strengthening? You can already use it." He asked to no one in particular. "I'll show you the gap between us," she yelled and looked at Indorsey. "And you too." Having said that, she extended her leg backwards and took a running stance. And then, without any delay, she dashed out, her body gaining speed like a bullet shot from a gun. Winston's eyes widened a bit, seeing her speed elevated to such a degree. Then, he smirked. With a though and concentrating his spirituality, he cast a spell of the Trickmaster potion, Tumble. The ground beneath Anak instantly turned slippery, making her slip and tumble towards the direction of Indorsey. Indorsey, who would have dodged otherwise, closed her eyes momentarily, seeing a bright flash of light whip past her eyes. Trickmaster spell. Light. With that, Anak Jihad slammed right into Indorsey Jihad, taking them both off of the platform. "Aya! You damn lizard! What do you think you're doing? Can't you hold me, you stupid freaky-eyed jerk? What are you doing?" Both of them yelled at each other as they fell down towards the ground underneath. Winston shook his head, amused by their antics. In the air, Hex also shook her head. "What are those two doing?" She put a hand on her mask, feeling a bit unsure about her initial judgment of the two princesses. "Well, Winston performed great anyway. I'll just give him some bonus points," she muttered at the end. Chapter 24. 1 month. Arg. That hurts. My pretty legs. I wish I had insurance on them. Indorsey yelled, holding her legs close to her abdomen with her face twisted in pain. Beside her, Anak also laid on the ground, writhing in pain and holding her legs through her skirt. "Insurance on those legs? You might as well set your money on fire." She managed to squeeze out through the pain. "What? I can't even see yours." Indorsey shot back. "Hey, I'm still young. Unlike you. Young. Don't kid yourself. I know you're older than me. So what? It's not like you're a kid still. You're as old as a grandma." "Grandma? How can you say that? I'm still single." With that, they quieted down for a moment, holding their legs in pain. "Hey!" Indorsey called out. "What?" "Anak Jihad. She died a long time ago." Indorsey continued. "She was killed by the Royal Enforcement Division for stepping out of the king's display cabinet," she said melancholically. Anak clicked her tongue. "What are you talking about?" she barely managed to say. Indorsey sighed. She fell in love with a man, right? And then ran away. You're not Anak Jihad, no? You're her daughter." Indorsey turned towards her, now facing her back. "My only niece in the entire tower," she said. Anak stayed quiet. Indorsey didn't say anything, choosing to stay in silence. After some time, Anak spoke. "My mother," she said, making Indorsey's ears perk up. She liked eating chicken pies. There was this cook in her hometown, the only cook in the region that would make the tastiest chicken pies ever. Anak sighed, reminiscing about forgotten memories that were resurfacing. She loved eating all of his food. The man would make her everything she ever wanted to eat, always trying his best to fulfill her wishes. Anak's fist tightened around an ethereal hand, possibly a figment of her imagination. "You're the greatest piece of jewelry I own, my dear princess." Something seemed to be stuck in her throat, for she could barely formulate any more words, much less get them out. "That cook was murdered by the sisters of my mother," she said. With that, they again descended into silence. Indorsey quietly looked at her back in quiet contemplation. "Hey!" she called out again. Anak stayed quiet. "Hey!" she called out again. "What? Did she ever regret it?" Anak turned over, looking at the sky quietly. In her eyes, pictures overlapped, vistas of the past that she wished had never transpired, events she wished had never come to pass, and memories she wished she could forget or on some way delude herself into falsification. She saw a burning house and her mother standing before it. Then, she passed her a small green pendant, the last gift she would ever give her mother. "Maybe," she said finally. "What type of answer is that?" Indorsey said, her tone devoid of the otherwise flamboyant and mischievous persona. Now, it sounded more like a child's whisper. "I want a clearer answer." They descended into silence for some time again. "That insufferable man hits like a tank." Dorsey muttered in pain as she massaged her face and abdomen. As her words landed, Anak also felt a slight sting in the places that had been hit by Winston, possibly even more so than her legs. The news about the injuries the two princesses suffered spread quickly, and so did the word of Winston's absurd strength at being able to solo two princesses of Jihad. Needless to say, Winston ignored all the attention he got. Aman came to him, looking to confirm if the rumors about him beating the two princesses were indeed true, of which he saw no reason to lie. Winston felt that doing so might put him under suspicion as his origins were less than comfortable. But as he had come to find out during the time he had been in Evankel's mothership, the tower was an expansive place, to such an extent that there were some regions that did not even know that they lived in a tower. For Winston, such news was pretty baffling to say the least. The test ground they were on was only a tiny part of the entire floor, which itself was further also a tiny part of the entire structure, considering how the floor of tests only included the inner tower and not the middle and the outer expanses. It all came together to make a structure that was incomparable in size to anything Winston could imagine the tower would be, completely transcending his expectations. Another thing that he had to mention was the fact that Kun, the mastermind, devised a plan for the scouts to pass their first assignment and for the two princesses to pass along. How? They bribed them with eel soup and told them to sign their papers. It was hardly honorable, but it was simple practical. Kun's intellect is always commendable. Winston smiled, thinking over Aman, who had his last friend in the list because of him. As he was thinking about the different regulars, his mind drifted over to Zarin, the ever-energetic spear-bearer. After the third day of spear-bearer training, Zarin was not seen by anyone. Same for Rao Wraithraiser the crocodile. For a moment, Winston even considered some sort of rivalry between the two that led to them piercing each other with their spears somewhere deep within the mountains. However, it was extremely unlikely. Possible, but not likely to happen. Shaking his head, Winston decided to stop thinking about it. Instead, he opted to think about the current task at hand. At the moment, he sat inside of his room, sitting cross-legged on the bed and his hands pressed on his knees. The room was quiet, shielded by his spirituality wall that isolated it from the outside. Winston gazed at the two orbs of bright light that floated around him at moderate speeds. There were two bongs of Shinsu. The amount of bongs one can make decides who gets the upper hand in battles. Because of my improved talent in all things spiritual related thanks to Fool and Door pathways, I can make two bongs plenty easily. Winston closed his eyes and focused his spirituality through cogitation. Then, the surrounding Shinsu began to bend to his will, transforming, bubbling and writhing into various shapes and forms, eventually twisting into a uniform shape of a sphere. As Winston kept concentrating, another ball of light slowly appeared around him and began to float around with the other balls of lights. 3 bong. And by a person cuttingly on the test floor no less. Winston laughed wryly. If news of this were to get out, surely he would be suspected of being an irregular. Normal people can manipulate Shinsu in their bodies through flow control in about 2 weeks. As for making a bong, that can only be done after extensive practice and study, and even then it takes about 3 years. Irregulars are really unfair to the tower. Truly capable of breaking the rules of the tower. Winston nodded in contemplation amid his cogitation. Inside, he also felt that his ability to make 3 bongs was a result of his improved talent. If not, he might as well struggle with 2. Winston opened his eyes, slowly getting himself out of his cogitative state. However, as he did so, slowly, one of the bongs began to ebb out. Winston immediately began to focus on it, which led to one of the others losing its uniformity and degrade into the air. Winston shook his head. Sure enough, using 3 bongs in combat would be hard. Practice is needed for further bongs. Winston turned towards the table beside the bed, where a stack of papers were kept. It was his research about Shinsu. As of now, Winston knew that all of the information, measuring systems and terminology of Shinsu was worked out by a single person, Pabaida Gustang, the head of the Pabaida family and one of the 11 irregulars that entered the tower. Besides that, there was also Ashilad Wardu, the creator of the 13-month series who wrote of the tower's weapons, which compiled his studies on Shinsu and how it compares to the outside air, and how it behaves completely different in different situations. However, Winston opted to do his own research. He knew very well that there were things that were not taught to the general populace for security reasons, and a lot of information that the higher-ups held were mainly confidential information. Although on Earth, information could largely be shared without too much problem, there were still pieces of information that could cause more harm than good if it were leaked to the outside. And considering how potent of an energy source, nay, not just an energy source, the thing that Shinsu was, there was bound to be some facts that were not generally taught, most likely reserved for the people in power or the so-called 10 great families. Of course, there was always a chance that Winston was wrong. Slim, but there still was. But even so, Winston was a discoverer at heart. Experimentation had become part of his nature at this point. And faced with something as limitless as Shinsu, he could hardly contain himself from studying it extensively. He cast aside the 2 bongs he had created and walked over to the research papers. Tales from the Lake. The upper cover read. He had chosen such a title purely for aesthetic purposes. Simply naming his research paper, Shinsu Studies, or On the Divine Water, although seemed somewhat logical, didn't sit right in Winston's own mind. As such, he named the research paper, Tales from the Lake, to depict the water-like nature of the Shinsu. Although such a title is inherently flawed, since Shinsu didn't behave solely like water in the first place. In fact, it would have been better to refer to the papers as Tales of Everything. Actually, when I think about it, that doesn't sound as cool. Oh well, it's not like I'm going to publish it or anything. Winston shrugged his shoulders and decided to not worry about the name anymore. Opening the research papers, he decided to revise all the points he had researched up until now. He had his pocket appear beside him and began to search on the box for more information on the subject. That day, Winston spent the entire night researching again. The next day, Zarin and Rak returned from somewhere. Both of them appeared exceptionally happy, even banding together to troll the other regulars and eat several chocolate bars and bananas. Just like that, almost the entirety of the regular group of the test floor became friends. And slowly but surely, an entire month had passed in the blink of an eye. Chapter 25. Hide and Seek. Regulars participating in this joint position test. Congratulations to all of you. Luro Aro yelled out to all the regulars that were gathered in the hall. 1 month had elapsed since the classes started for the positions, between which everyone mastered their respective skills and opted to make full usage of their respective advantages that their positions provided them with. Winston in particular was the best in the fisherman position, no surprise in that, just behind Indorsey and Anak, who managed to not get disqualified from the test, all their injuries considered. Everyone's relationship had also progressed to some point, not appearing as distant as before. In particular, everyone that had their name on the friend list that was given to the scouts had come especially close. Winston focused on Luro Aro, who was explaining what the test to be conducted would be. This joint test is for 30 of you, excluding the ones that have already passed, he said, pointing to the sofas that were erected at the end of the hall atop an elevated platform. On the sofas, 3 familiar figures sat. Bwahahaha. Do your best, turtles. Ye all ought to give it your all. You might not pass. Ha 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 ha. Zarin and Rak sat on the sofa laughing to their heart's content. Their arms were slung over each other's shoulders. Well, at least Rak's arm was. Zarin's was too short to go over Rak's body. Both of them appeared extremely cheerful as they laughed out aloud at the regulars present, mocking them for not being able to pass the tests beforehand. Looking at them, Winston felt a hint of annoyance but brushed it off. He wasn't in the spear-bearer position anyways, so he had no reason to feel pressured by the fact that there was only room for 1 more passing regular for the spear-bearers. Winston looked at the last person seated atop the sofas. Ghost, the behemoth-like beast that towered a full 3 heads over even Rak. Winston narrowed his eyes a bit, but then focused again on the test administrator. Of the 30 regulars present, there will be 2 teams of 15. The regulars should take the test in the team assigned to them. Luro Aro continued. Teams have all been assigned based on the previous test results. There is an equal number of positions on both teams except for 1 more spear-bearer and scout on Team A, and 1 more light-bearer and fisherman on Team B, so the teams are completely balanced. He said. You will be graded throughout the test, and said grades will have the most say in the final assessment, so be at your best performance. He continued. For your information, the grading will be done both individually and as a team, by your position teachers and by the test director respectively. He pointed to the right, where a large desk with 6 seats was kept. On each seat was seated one of the position teachers as well as the test director Han Sung-yu in the last seat. However, curiously, one of the seats of the position teachers was empty. As for how the test will be conducted, what will be told by the test director Han Sung-yu? Luro Aro pointed towards the man who took a sip from his coffee bowl. Han Sung-yu smiled. I will be telling you about your test. It will be called Hide and Seek. He smiled mysteriously. Hearing his words, murmurs went across the group of regulars. Hide and seek? Winston's mind materialized images of a game that he's seen kids play all the time. A game that he himself had never had the opportunity to play. Winston's eyes turned melancholic for a moment, almost imperceptible, before reverting back to normal. Yes, it is like the game that you all might have played at some point. But it's not a team competition. He chuckled. Each team will play with a seeker that we've designated to catch a hider that the team designates. Han Sung pointed to the window on the left. If you look outside from here, you will find a large circular structure floating. That is the stage for the test, he said. Every regular, Winston included, moved closer to the window to get a better look at the stage for the test. It was a large circular ship, divided up into 3 main areas. The center circle was the smallest, lying at the lowest level in the entire structure. It was labeled as the safe zone. From the safe zone, extended 2 sets of stairs that led to a larger circle concentric with the safe zone. It lied 1 level above the safe zone and had a small effigy of a humanoid figure standing within it. The effigy was marked, the Seeker. This zone itself was divided into 2 concentric spheres, one higher than the other and connected with a flight of stairs. Beyond this zone was a deep chasm that separated it from the final circle. All that connected it with the main body was a narrow bridge and a small flight of stairs some distance diagonally under it. The rules are simple, Han Sung-yu said as everyone looked on at the structure. Choose someone to be it among the fishermen. If the one who is it gets out of the safety zone and reaches the exit without getting tagged by the Seeker, the team wins. I will give you all 3 hours. Also, the game is over if the it is caught by the Seeker. Han Sung smiled and pulled out a red badge with an unusual symbol on it from his robes. The person who is chosen to be it is required to put this badge on. If the Seeker touches the badge, the sensor will be triggered and the game will end. Then, his eyes suddenly underwent a thoughtful expression, intently gazing at the regulars. Of course the Seeker will also be wearing such a badge. He smiled. If the one that is the Seeker gets tagged by anyone, then the game will end right there and the fisherman on the team will get a price of 2,000 points, enough to circumvent the results of the previous tests. Han Sung said. To his side, Winston immediately felt Dorsey's mood lighten up. Her eyes held a predatory gleam as they almost shone with greed. Winston imperceptibly shook his head. Shibisu raised his hand from the other team. Test Director Yu, who is the Seeker? He asked. At that moment, a frivolous voice boomed out in the hall. Ha ha ha. That's my student. It's great that you asked such a nice question. The door to the far entrance of the hall opened up, revealing a dark-skinned individual in a white lab coat and black pants. He had bright red hair that almost shone in the brightly lit hall, and his face held a wide smile from ear to ear. His eyes held a rambunctious vigor that seemed to almost materialize around him, and the sound of his laughter suddenly filled the hall. At that moment, Winston noticed how every position teacher, Luro Ro in particular, face-bombed with a sour expression. Well, that's not good. It could be accurately judged that Winston was not looking forward to the test anymore. Fighting against a ranker? What makes them think we can do that? Winston contemplated. What the hell? That's a ranker. We can't snatch the badge from him. This is rigged. He's the scout teacher. A ranker. And the reactions of the regulars spoke for themselves. Quant, the scout ranker, laughed aloud harder upon hearing the reactions of the various people in the room. Ha 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 ha. Don't worry. I'll make sure to go easy on you, he yelled. Every regular in the room, at that exact moment, had the same thought. Like hell you will. Seeing all of their distressed faces, Han Sung-yu chuckled. Do not worry too much. We are well aware of the gap between you and rankers. He continued. To make sure the test is fair, Quant is only limited to a single bong with 10 myeon and 10 su, so no body strengthening and no extra support from Shinsu. Furthermore, he would not go all out against regulars. That would be simply overkill. Han Sung shook his head and shrugged. Winston looked at him judgmentally for a second at the mention of overkill, but there was little he could do. The test had already been decided, and it was plenty clear that they were going to fight the ranker. With that, they were separated as per the teams. 15 people were in each team, with the teams being named A and B. While they were escorted through the hall, Winston could clearly hear the laughter of Zarin and Rak in the background at all times. It was to the point he began to feel a tad bit annoyed. Damn crocodile and pea-brain. He cursed in his heart. Then he shook his head and smiled with a light chuckle. Team A included Anak, Kun, Lore, Shibisu and Amon among their own group. The rest were filled by people Winston didn't know the names of, except for the red-haired girl who only had one eye because of the crown game, Warian. While Team B was the team Winston was in, which comprised of Dorsey, Pericule, Hats, Bam and Ho. There was also the strange girl Bam was chasing, who was named Michelle Light, a pseudonym by Bam's own opinion, as her real name was Rachel. Winston looked at the boy from the corner of his eyes with a thoughtful expression. Within the month he had spent on the floor of tests, the boy had made plenty clear his apparent lack of knowledge about almost anything in the tower, along with his more than questionable living conditions prior to entering the tower, saying how he only had the one girl to talk to. Aren't all irregulars supposed to be busted even at the floor of tests? I wouldn't even compare him to a jihad princess. Winston mused, scratching his chin. At this point, he had all but concluded the fact that Bam was an irregular. He wouldn't be deserving of having a brain if he couldn't even piece that together. First things first, he learned flow control within a day, without any prior knowledge of Shinsu control. As per the norms of the tower, even the prodigies among the wave controller learned Shinsu flow control to make bongs within 1 year. It made Winston remember his own feat of creating a bong on his first try during the crown game. Even if his monstrously frightening ability to learn Shinsu flow control within a day, as per Lore's words, was ignored, there was the matter of where he lived before entering the tower. If anything, it sounded awfully like the darkened caves that he was in for some time before he eventually went through the gate to the tower. All of that combined made Winston conclude him as the target for being an irregular. However, since he's an irregular, Winston's eyes traveled to the figure of Michelle Light, or better yet, Rachel. Since Bam tells about how he only had her in the dark place, that also makes her an irregular. The situation almost made Winston's head shake. It was 3 irregulars in the same testing spot. As per his knowledge, even a single irregular brought such chaos to the tower that the states before and after their entry couldn't be compared. Heh! How will 3 irregulars shake the tower? Winston chuckled. Chapter 26. Hide and Seek. 2 Darkness prowled all around, blocking all light from vision. The darkness seemed so thick that it was better to describe it as pitch black than simple shadows, with the only real source of light being a metallic cube that floated in the air with a deep blue tinge. The lighthouse casted a direct light towards the ground, lighting up the plain white floor atop which walked a man with a purple track suit. The man had an average-looking face with a lean build that didn't suggest any muscle at first glance. Sigh. The man sighed, notions and visions flooding his mind unbidden. I'm going to be hospitalized after this, aren't I? I hope he doesn't break a bone. I wanna go home. Shibasu's mind was a mess, his consciousness and rationality like a piece of insubstantial fog that phased in and out of existence, the reason of which was his current predicament, as per which he was the bait. Team A organized themselves rather quickly with Kun at the forefront. Kun was truly a mastermind at planning, effortlessly formulating a plan that the ranker wouldn't expect and winning the trust of all the participants. However, to Shibasu, his plan couldn't be said to be ideal. Why? Simple, their plan was unlike traditional thinking, which was to seize the ranker's badge and win the game without ever leaving the second circle. However, Shibasu was the bait to draw in the ranker first, a way for them to prepare in advance when the ranker arrives and land a decisive victory. It's so dark. It's like he could pop up at any moment from anywhere. Scouts really aren't a great position. Shibasu lamented at his fate. Should I change positions? He thought. Just then, something spoke into his ears. Hey! Can you hear me? Shibasu jumped at the voice, screaming out in he process. Bastard! You scared me! He yelled back. Why are you getting scared? You're supposed to attract the ranker, Kun said in reply. Shibasu shook his head, readjusting the communication tool in his ear. Isn't it bad? What? That Bam is on another team. As his words landed, Shibasu felt the voice on the other end go quiet for a split second. Too bad. But what can we do? It was designated, he said simply. Don't you know? If we catch the Seeker, there's almost no chance for Bam to pass the test. Shibasu shook his head, feeling pity for the boy. I know. But we can't give up the test because of him, right? In a test, it's every man for themselves, he said. You're cold-hearted. Thank you. Shibasu's expression turned a bit strange at the awkward topic of conversation. What about the ranker? He asked. Shibasu looked on into the darkness, and then he focused on the observers, tools that aided scouts in mapping out the area and sending back information. I don't see anything. Nothing on the observers either, he said. Suddenly, he perked up. Why do you think he will come? It's pretty obvious I'm the bait with this big lighthouse. He pointed to the lighthouse up above. However, the grim tone of Kun came in response. He come. For sure. Shibasu's sweat dropped at his confidence. Suddenly, his eyes widened. Kun. Yes. He's here. Shibasu adopted a combat stance, holding his fists in front of him. The wind around him seemed to get restless, which was strange in and of itself, since the Shinsu density inside the sphere was particularly dense, even making it hard for Anak to move. The strange howl of the wind rang in his ears as strange whispers seemed to come from the darkness. And then, he turned to the right. His eyes met two glowing red dots, moving about in the darkness. Your two observers move about in predictable patterns. Easy to avoid if you're a good enough scout. A voice called out from the red dots. The lighthouse's light extended, illuminating the darkness ahead and eventually making the ranker appear from the darkness. Quant stood in place with a smile and chuckled. Why are you standing around like that? You're making it so obvious that you're the bait. He smiled. Team B sat in a room with a large round table. They were seated in a semicircle with a large television screen in front, displaying the happenings of the first game of hide-and-seek which the Team A were partaking in. Winston sat with Bam to his right and Serena to his left. Further to the right, next to Bam sat the Princess of Jihad, in Dorsey, who was getting flattered by one of the fishermen on the team. Winston shook his head and smiled compassionately as he looked on at his team. There was no need for him to do anything in the test, to be honest. Within the fisherman position, he had the highest chances to be promoted further and passing the test. Not to mention his points, which still stood at the impressive number of 4,800. Far more than the amount the chosen fisherman was promised to get upon tagging the seeker. That was the reason that Winston was not worried in the slightest. He was going to pass anyway. All he needed to do was participate and show off some of his potential and strength. I hate this team. What am I going to do with all of their useless regulars? The regular that had been smothering in Dorsey with flattery and sweet words yelled suddenly. Then, his tone took a direct change and appeared almost subservient. Of course that doesn't include you, oh glorious Princess of Jihad, he said. In Dorsey's smile and her eyes momentarily wandered towards Winston, who sat just one seat across from her. Then, she shook her head. You're our team's only hope. The regular yelled again. Oh sweet. She smiled sweetly towards him. Then, Serena, who sat on Winston's left, pointed towards the screen and called out. Look. They've already met the seeker. She yelled. Everyone turned their eyes towards the screen, looking at the scene of Quant engaging in a conversation with Shibisu. They already found them without an observer? Are the rankers that fast? Someone yelled. Rankers are scary. Someone droned. Winston contemplated. Even if it's a ranker, the test has only just started 5 minutes ago. The ranker will take his time traveling to each contestant to gauge them out for assessment. At the end, the chosen, it had only one way to go, which is the thin bridge that leads to the exit. He only needs to catch them at that point. With Anak's speed, reaching that point can be said to be a moderately easy task, if not for the Shinsa density. Winston shook his head. With all those factors combined, it doesn't make sense for the ranker to be so fast in his approach. And that means a single thing. They're purposefully leading him into a trap. And he followed to see what they would do. Either Shibisu has acted as the bait to stall the ranker so Anak has more time to reach the exit, which would eventually fail due to Anak's reduced speed and the ranker's comparatively monstrous movement potential, or the second strategy. Winston's eyes sharpened suddenly. They're planning to snatch the badge right then and there. He smiled. Either one can be called an optimum strategy, and neither has better chances at succeeding. But thinking of Kun. Winston's eyes traveled to the screen as his smile widened. On the screen, Quant talked with Shibisu for some time, about how there were spear bearers and fishermen close by for an ambush. And then, the red-haired ranker proceeded to dodge spears thrown at him and destroy the lighthouse in the air, taking care of the light source to confuse the people and seize the initiative. Quite a nice strategy. I suppose I comes with experience. Winston mused. Then, the ranker moved about in the darkness unimpeded by the utter loss of vision. Suddenly, a lighthouse turned on in the distance, casting its light onto the ranker who was behind Shibisu. The light of the lighthouse extended to reveal a green-skinned girl with a real inventory floating behind her, Anak. Winston watched on as Anak threw a hook attached to the real inventory, wanting to tag the seeker and win the game right then and there. In that moment, Winston even felt that might just win, solely because of the surprise factor of the attack. However, just as the hook was about to touch the badge on the ranker, a howl of the wind sounded out. Oh! With that, the ranker disappeared into thin air, merging into the darkness around him in a burst of speed and camouflaging into the surroundings. Winston drew in a short breath, thinking of what might happen further into the fight. Quant, as he understood him, was an incredibly petty individual who did not like to lose and went all out even against regulars on the test floor. And the ambush to tag the seeker at this point was a blatant disregard for his strength. Winston chuckled as the regulars in the room were riled up, shouting things like, "Take care of them already," and "Way to go! Kill them all." After that, the red-haired ranker gave them 30 minutes and 32 seconds to do whatever they wanted and to run. And so, the run was on. They underestimated the ranker. Their oversight in the plans led to them getting behind in the opportunity to go for the exit. Winston shook his head in disappointment. It's always better to overestimate an opponent than to underestimate them. Kun ought to have known the capabilities of a ranker quite well, given that he's from the Kun family. Winston scratched his chin and looked towards Bam, who was beside him. Bam appeared quite shaken, his eyes widened and his pupils shrunken down. Winston narrowed his eyes and looked on at the screen. Unless he has some other plans to speak of. Winston took another look at Bam and smirked. What do you think? He asked. Bam turned to him and turned his head quizzically. What? Team A. What do you think? Will they pass? He asked. Bam shook his head with utmost confidence. Yes, they will pass. Winston chuckled. Shouldn't you be hoping for them to fail? You're on Team B, they aren't your teammates now. He laughed. Bam looked down, appearing conflicted. Should I wish for that? He asked. Winston looked at him. Maybe. You tell me. He chortled. Bam didn't speak anything. To the side, Dorsey looked at them with an unknown expression. Chapter 27. Hide and Seek 3. After the 30 minutes was up, the ranker was on the move. Shibisu moved about the darkness, a spare lighthouse lighting up the way before him. Sweat poured out from his temples his never before, for the situation was stressful enough. They had successfully managed to anger the ranker through their shenanigans at wanting to tag the seeker. However, they had vastly underestimated the movement speed of the ranker, a crucial overstep that might cost them their victory. Where is Anak? Shibisu yelled as he ran towards the elevator to the second circle. She's going up the second circle through the elevator. The ranker is on the move, so there isn't much time. I'm already up there. Kun's voice came promptly from his earpiece. Shibisu breathed a sigh of partial relief. Then he shook his head. He continued running along the darkened floor, the lighthouse in the air lighting up his way. A dark staircase led to an unknown upper floor, its narrow area and steep steps making it the easiest places to lay for an ambush. The darkened halls made way for little light and everything was increasingly harder to see. However, perched atop the stairs were multiple spear-bearers, wave controller, and a scout, Amon. They all looked on towards the bottom of the stairs, their lighthouse casting light onto the entire structure. Sweat trickled down from some of their faces because of the tense atmosphere. Amon stood at the back, a bag at his side. His eyes looked on in nervousness as notions about a potential loss filled his mind. Suddenly, he shook his head. No, I can't lose hope. Mr. Winston and Zarin took a lot of time in training me. He exclaimed in his mind. Within the month of their stay in Evankel's mothership, Winston and Zarin had taken it upon themselves to train Amon to the bone, resulting in a rapid increase of his strength. Amon is talented, yet failed to make his talent shine through in the earlier stages of his life. As of right now, Amon was one of the highest-ranking scouts in his class, just behind Hats and tying with Shibisu. His eyes held a resolute look as an announcement echoed in the surroundings. One of the light-hearers with them yelled out. He's here. At the bottom of the stairs. Every regular that was present felt their hearts tighten. They all looked down at the bottom, where a certain red-haired ranker was walking about leisurely. Well, what an interesting place to lay an ambush. He smirked. How about we have a little lesson? He said, beginning to walk up the stairs with deliberate weight. As you know, I only have one bong with 10 myeon and 10 su, which isn't a lot really. It's not even enough to kill a regular man. He shrugged his shoulders. However, to escape from the likes of you. He droned. Then, the darkness around him seemed to come alive as it writhed and slithered atop his own body. The shadows beneath his feet cast by the lighthouse traveled up his legs and merged him into the darkness. Nay, it was not the darkness he was merging into, it was simply the environment itself. The regular's eyes widened in alarm. He went invisible. Attack anywhere. One of the wave controllers yelled, firing a bong from a staff they held. The spear-bearers needed no further starting signal. The red spear they held in their hands were thrown down with speed, going down and embedding themselves into the stairs. A fisherman jumped down with his needle, only for Quan to reveal himself and backhand him into the wall with sheer strength. Then, one of the spear-bearers, a hulking man with wings atop his back, jumped down and tried to engage in hand-to-hand combat. A spear-bearer leaving his post? Why would you sacrifice your advantage of range and choose to fight in a way that you're clearly not adept in? Quant asked quizzically as he toyed with the regular with his speed. Needless to say, the regular didn't last very long. Quant traveled up the stairs, dodging every other spear that was thrown at him effortlessly. As he reached the top, he laughed. I assume you were going to keep me here for at least 5 minutes. Come on. Where's your motivation? He yelled. How much time has it been? One of the regulars stammered. 1 minute. A regular spoke. In the team room, Winston felt as if the combat was happening all too quickly. The regulars didn't stand a sliver or a chance against someone that had climbed to the top of the tower. There was simply no way for them to win, at least not with so little strength. Perhaps if it was Anak and Indorsey working together they could pose a certain challenge. He mused. Back in the test, Quant took little time to take care of the other regulars, eventually leaving only Amon and the lightbearer that was with him. Amon looked at him in nervousness. So what will you do? Quant asked with a smile. You should be decisive in your action. Nervousness will get you nowhere in a place like the tower, he advised with a sincere tone. Shaking himself out of his thoughts, Amon took a combat stance, ready to face the ranker and stall for as much time as possible. Quant raised a brow at his display. Brave, aren't you? Are you sure you can face me on your own? He asked, a light chuckle following his comment. Amon shook his head and smiled. I don't need to defeat you, he said. I don't need to do anything to you. Truthfully, I don't think I can even lay a finger on a ranker like you're. He smiled. Hearing his words, Quant felt his confidence taking a slight boost. He nodded with his eyes closed. That's right. Amon smiled seeing his reaction. In his mind, the objective was clear. Stall for as much time as possible. Whether it be through talking or fighting. Anything that can stall the seeker will provide them with more chances to pass the test. Amon raised his hands in front of him. But, he said, making Quant focus on him again. All I need to do is keep you here for as long as I can. And I will be sure to do that, he said. Quant nodded in satisfaction. As expected of my student. You have learned well, Quant exclaimed. Then, his eyes took on a glare. Then let's start. With that said, his figure dashed out, rapidly approaching the figure of Amon. Amon's muscles tightened as he punched out in front. His observer, a floating ball with a camera and a mini lighthouse installed in it, illuminated the area so he could fight. Quant stopped just before him, narrowly avoiding the fist he had thrown. Amon hurriedly switched to a drop kick and jumped straight at Quant. I'll give you some tips as well, Quant spoke, sidestepping from the kick and punching Amon, who was in mid-air, into the ground. When in front of a stronger opponent, never leave your ground. Doing so makes you open to attacks from a skilled opponent, he said. Only do so if you are adept at utilizing the shinsu around you to alter your position mid-air, something that you aren't capable of just yet. Amon quickly got to his feet and dashed at him again. The ranker disappeared in a burst of speed, appearing behind Amon. Amon turned quickly, throwing a spinning back kick at the opponent. However, Quant blocked his kick with his hand and kicked his other leg, making his fall face first into the ground. Damn! He cursed and got up again. I would love to play with you more, but I have places to be. Quant smiled. And then, his fist embedded itself into his abdomen with a howl of the wind. Bam! Shah! The air was blown out of Amon's lungs as saliva flew out of it. His eyes momentarily clouded over as he lost consciousness for a second. Then, he crouched down holding his stomach in pain. Heat rushed through his spine as his abdomen felt as if it had been set on fire from the inside out. Huff! Huff! He struggled to breathe for a second before he looked up to see Quant looking down at him with a smile. You're quite sturdy. A blow like that has knocked out every other regular so far. He nodded in acknowledgement. Amon smiled and got up from his seating position. Then, a crooked grin made its way onto his face. I've done a lot of durability training with my friends, he said, and put a hand into the bag he had at his side. His hands rummaged through the bag for a few seconds, and then he pulled something out. It was a large knife, just shorter than a shirt sword. He held it out in front of him and adopted a combat stance again. Quant chuckled seeing him ready to fight. Are you sure you want to do this? He asked. Amon smiled as he said, my job is to keep you here as long as I can. Quant looked at him for a moment. There was silence in the darkened expanse for a moment. Nobody moved. Then, both moved towards each other at the same time. Bang! Whoosh! In the team room, Winston watched on as Amon faced the ranker. He nodded to himself, quite pleased with Amon's progress. He and Zarin had personally worked on his combat training as well as durability exercises, in order to better equip him with the strength to stand strong blows. It seemed that the training had actually paid off. However, even then, it was hardly a match for the ranker. Quant made quick work of him as well, taking care of everyone gathered at the stairs in a measly 3 minutes and 27 seconds, with the bulk of the time spent dealing with Amon. After that, Team B erupted into cheers as the ranker made his way across all the remaining team members, crushing them like a truck hitting a bicycle at Mach speeds. Eventually, the ranker came face to face with Shibisu, who held onto his legs for a good while to give Anak a chance to escape. After that, the ranker ran ahead and eventually, he reached the bridge. It seems that they will fail, Winston said suddenly, turning his eyes to look at Bam. Bam was startled by his voice, but then his eyes turned droopy and melancholic. It seems so, he droned. Are you not relieved? Winston asked. Bam looked at him in puzzlement. The failure of the opposing team means higher chances for us to win. And that means... Winston smiled at him. That there will be more chances that you might find the girl you're looking for. His face morphed into a toothy grin as he chuckled. Bam's eyes seemed to turn brighter at the mention of Rachel, however. He turned to look at the screen again, not replying to Winston's remark. Winston shook his head. Choices are hard to make, especially choices like these, he thought in his heart. Inwardly, he pitied the boy to some extent. Left in darkness all his life, with the only human interaction ever being a young girl with blonde hair. However, the girl left him behind to chase after the stars, and the boy was left without a goal to aspire towards, without the shining light that had guided his world thus far. And in such a place as the tower, there was no saying how and when a friend may turn into an enemy, and an enemy turn ally. Winston looked towards Rachel, who still adorned the dark brown cloak atop her head. Eventually, I suppose you might need to make such a choice. He shook his head imperceptibly, feeling even more pitiful. Then, a smile blossomed on his face. But even still, the only thing you'll ever be able to do is to smile through it. Chapter 28. Hide and Seek 4. Winston walked along the safe zone of their spherical test zone. Team A's battle had ended not long after Quant took care of Shibisu. He reached the final bridge upon which Anak was supposedly treading towards, only to find Kun at that place. However, Quant supposedly saw through Kun's plan to hide Anak on a lighthouse and wanted to drag him down towards the chasm below, only to then be shocked at the fact that Kun had expected all of this and was waiting for him to make his move. In the end, Kun and Anak made their way back to the bridge while the ranker fell down into the chasm. However, they failed to make through with the victory? How? Quant, in a move that even surprised Winston, ran all the up the chasm without the usage of Shinsu. I hadn't expected the ranker to be so strong even without the use of Shinsu. He shook his head. I don't know much about the strength of the rankers, but Kun must have been knowledgeable about it. It doesn't make sense for there to be an oversight in his plans 2 times. Though I suspect it has something to do with Bam being in an opposite team. Winston mused, scratching his chin. Come to think of it, didn't Kun leave the bridge after he came back up? Could he have helped the ranker get back up? Winston felt more and more sure about his theory. Even for a ranker, rushing up such a deep chasm seemed to be more than a chore, especially without Shinsu. Unless one was a ranker from the Ha family, known for their sturdy and strong bodies, or a princess of Jihad, Winston wasn't sure if they would be able to jump up the height. He scratched his head and shrugged. There's no comparison I can make with any other ranker. In the end, I can only speculate. He shook his head. Then, he looked over towards the center of the safe zone, where every other regular from Team B was gathered. His eyes, enhanced by Marauder and Swindler potions, saw perfectly through the dark, and with combined reinforcement from the Shinsu, it felt as if he stood in a perfectly lit hall, instead or the darkened place he stood at. It was also the reason there was no lighthouse around him. Having looked at the area all around, most of which was just plain, he made his way back to the center. Before the Seeker was released, the regulars were given a small buffer period for choosing it and sorting out their respective roles in the test. With Winston's unique position, he didn't want to partake too much in the test. He would pass regardless of the test results. The reason being his overwhelming amount of points in comparison to everyone else and the fact that, for some inexplicable reason, perhaps for his latent potential being seen, the ranker hex favored him among the regulars of the Fisherman class. As Winston reached the center of the safe zone, he saw everyone gathering around and arguing about being the leader. A variety of proposals were put forth by the different regulars, as was the willingness to become the leader of their group. However, none was willing to take the risk of potentially having a lackluster leader, especially the spear-bearers who only has one remaining place in the final passing batch. Some time elapsed within the darkness. Eventually, everyone began to shout at each other, with no one willing to back down and adopt the other person's strategy for the test. Winston could perceive that the regulars were themselves beginning to grow quite restless, appearing more and more nervous. He shook his head, feeling a bit regretful about them. Without cooperating you won't get anywhere in this test, he thought. Then again, this might as well be an individual test. What Winston had concluded had many reasons behind it. In the first place, however difficult it was to win, winning the game did not provide benefits to a single person. Instead, It equally gave out the points between all regulars. And each regular, because they were being graded individually by their teachers all along the length of the test, was seemingly on their own without any official allies to speak of. Since everyone was competing for a chance in their own positions, one not only had to compete with the other team, but also with those on the same position as one in their own team. Winston looked on as the group became more and more chaotic. He had no reason to help out, neither did he intend to. He was simply here for the participation award, one could say. At the corner of his eyes, he noticed both Bam and Dorsey stealing glances in his direction, most likely hoping for him to take charge of the situation. Winston smiled as he looked on towards the ensuing chaos amidst the regulars. Then, at the crucial point, Dorsey stood up with an annoyed snarl on her face. "Gosh. You lot are annoying me. I'll be it. You all follow my lead," she declared, her voicing silencing all others that spoke before her. Winston raised a brow at her act. With that, everyone expressed their tactic approval. What could they do if they didn't? Someone strong was needed to lead the team, and Dorsey was just that. After the matters with the team leadership was sorted out, everyone began to move about as per Dorsey's plan. The fishermen were to move all together, and were expected to change position as the ranker moved about the darkness. The spear bearers and hats were to intercept the scout at the stairs to the second circle, and finally, the light bearers and the wave controller were to collect information in the safe zone and assist the fishermen and scouts respectively. It was a logical plan in hindsight, but one that had all too many loopholes in place. And as a swindler, Winston was especially sensitive about such loopholes. Fishermen moving together, huh? Winston smiled as he figured out what Dorsey wanted to do. As for the different regulars that were to delay the seeker, simply put, they were the bait meant to stall until Dorsey's plan could come to fruition. Naturally, Winston was not included in such a plan, since it would fail if Dorsey targeted him, and she knew that quite well. Yet, here he was traveling with them still, only because he had made his position quite clear in the test. He would not interfere too much in the proceedings. The band of fishermen ran across the darkness with a lighthouse in front of them. The Shinsa density around them made the fishermen especially slow, as the pressure around them was much larger than they had accustomed themselves to. Winston and Dorsey were the only ones that could maintain their normal speed, with Winston barely noticing a change at all. Winston stole a glance at Bam, who was running along beside them. The irregular boy also seemed to be not terribly affected by the Shinsa density in the area, appearing perfectly fine. Winston smiled. "Let's rest here for a moment," one of the fishermen said. Dorsey only nodded and sat down, supporting her back against the wall. As they sat down to rest, the one that was showering the princess with compliments spoke out again. "How did you come up with such a plan, princess?" he asked. "I don't know. It just hit me, you know?" Dorsey flashed a charming smile at him. "Oh, that's it. You truly deserve to be called a princess of jihad." The other fisherman that was beside them held onto his sword and spoke. "We should quickly be on the move again. We never know when the ranker might start to move," he said. "Don't worry and relax. The princess said the ranker won't come to us until he examines all the other regulars first." The man replied. "Relax? In such a situation, that might lead to failure," he countered. "Princess, looks like we have a non-believer." Winston cringed at his remark, instead opting to turn his head away from the situation. Alas, he couldn't turn off his hearing. "Then, hang him." Hearing her words, Winston couldn't help but remember the Habged man, Alger, and the true rapper? Or was it the true creator? "What?" the man with the sword exclaimed. "Lock him up," Dorsey declared. "Haha. You're dead, you idiot." Winston shook his head in genuine annoyance. "What idiots? Can't even see their own doom," he lampooned. "I'm excited for the second round," Hex exclaimed with a clap. To the side, the other potions teachers expressed their doubts through their expression. "What's wrong?" asked the wave controller teacher, a strange creature that looked to be a speaking rice ball. "I don't know. It's just that the regulars in Team 2 don't seem all that impressive," he said. Hex tilted her head but nodded after some thoughts. "What? We can't be partial against regulars," the rice ball exclaimed. The spear-bearer teacher, Bok-Dol, shook his head. "It's not that. It's just the fact that I don't see a lot of promise in the team. I mean, sure, there are two powerful fishermen, but the spear-bearers are—" He didn't finish his sentence. To his side, Hex nodded with her chest puffed out, as if in pride. "The fishermen in the second team are truly one of the most promising I've ever seen. I am confident they will perform well." She nodded. The other teachers still looked somewhat dispirited. The light-bearer teacher, Luro Aro, spoke. "Come to think of it." He turned towards Han Sung-yu. Don't the two teams seem awfully imbalanced? All the good wave controller were on the first team. The only good members of the second team are Winston, Dorsey, Hats, and Michelle Light, he said. Han Sung-yu flashed a friendly and compassionate smile, appearing full of energy as he took another sip from his coffee. No. Both the teams are incredibly well balanced, he said. The rice ball turned his head and spoke. I think so too, he exclaimed. Every teacher turned to him, their jaws somewhat opened in surprise. Even Han Sung-yu looked surprised, his team cup dropping from his hands and onto the ground. Hey, you're not supposed to be surprised, the rice ball yelled in his mind. Is there anyone that you might think will be useful among the wave controllers? Hex asked. The rice ball flashed a beautiful smile. Well, there is one, he droned. Is that regular that powerful? I wouldn't say powerful. He shook his head. More like, how should I explain? It's more like he's akin to a lottery ticket, he exclaimed. Lottery ticket? Bok Dolu asked. Yes, like the one I purchased yesterday, he exclaimed. He's got a lot of potential for sure. More potential than I've seen in anyone all my life. Hex chuckled. Well, it seems that both our classes have something in common. Winston Heath, right? A pity he isn't in wave controller class. I would have taught him some flashy moves. Hex shook her head. No. He is best suited for the Fisherman class, I believe. I think he can be put in any position really. Luro Aro said from the side. Yeah, but the best for him is undoubtedly the Fisherman, Hex declared with certainty. Chapter 29. Hide and Seek 5. A lone lighthouse stood alone in the darkness, illuminating a small circular area under it with an orange hue. Under the lighthouse stood two humanoid figures, one evidently male and one female. It was Serena and Ho, the scout and the wave controller. Serena looked over into the darkness, her eyes holding a complicated gaze. Phew, she breathed out. Phew, wow. She braked out again, making Ho look at her strangely. Suddenly she spoke out. Hey Ho, she said. What? I was just singing. Hey Ho. Hey Ho. Ha ha ha. She laughed at her joke, holding her stomach while doing so. Ho looked at her with an annoyed expression, but couldn't quite tell what was wrong with her to act as so. He stayed quiet and didn't speak. Hey Ho, she called out. Ho didn't say anything, choosing to stay quiet. I'm talking to you this time. Ho looked over towards her again. What? Serena sat down to the ground and cradled her legs to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. Then, she supported her head with her knees and looked sideways into the dark. Why? Why did you come to the tower? Ho looked at her in puzzlement. Pardon? Why are you choosing to go up? She asked. What this all of a sudden? He asked, his eyes narrowing to some degree, not in suspicion, but perhaps reminiscent of some old vistas and memories that remain a thing of the far past. No, it's just, watching Team A take the test just made me think a lot. She continued. I feel so down. She sighed again. Ho didn't say anything, only looking at her. I was just an ordinary girl before this. I stole goods from ships in the outer tower. I was a thief. One day, on a ship we were planning on robbing, a ranker was there. Her lip quivered, as if in deep sadness. He was so strong. I had heard of them before, but never thought he would be so monstrous. My partner was killed without any chance of resistance. Serena looked over at Ho's face, seeing him stay quiet. I was barely able to hide in time, and then I prayed. I prayed with all my heart like I'd never before. I said, if you're listening, please save me. My whole life has been nothing but crap until now. Serena looked towards the roof of the spherical structure, where darkness loomed like every other direction. And then? Her eyes clouded over momentarily, a strange memory appearing in her mind. A real god appeared before me. She didn't say anything for a few seconds afterwards, perhaps reminiscing about something. I didn't hesitate to take his hand and enter the tower. During the first brutal test to cut us down to 200, I didn't hesitate then as well. Serena laid down completely onto the ground, her eyes looking at the ceiling. Every time I killed someone, I felt free. Every time, I felt closer to becoming a ranker. I wanted such power. I craved for it. I wanted everything that the top had to offer. Her breath hicked for a moment. I just had so much rage. I was lucky enough to pass the next test. And truly, I thought to myself, yes, I did it. She turned her head towards Ho, her eyes clouding over slightly. But then when I watched Team A take the test so earnestly, they all tried so hard to pass, All of them are good people. I thought to myself, would it really be worth it at the top if I have to climb up all of these people? She huffed. At that moment, I realized the thing that had been holding me up all this time, even on the test floor. She gave out a crooked smile. Wow, this sucks, I thought. Ho continued to look at her face for a moment before speaking out. Everyone had to prepare for that moment when they first came into the tower. He clenched his teeth. Me, you, or anyone that ever came into the tower, they all knew the price and were willing to pay for it. He looked down at his feet. Everyone understands. So don't worry, he said. Serena stayed quiet for a moment. Then Ho, if I were to use you as a stepping stone, if I were to cause your fall, you won't blame me? She asked. I won't, Ho said without hesitation. I am prepared for failure. Eventually, someone else will use me as a stepping stone. Ho also flashed a crooked smile. Isn't that how it is from day one? He turned his back towards her. So let's not blame each other. Serena looked at his back for a moment, feeling unsure about her conflicting emotions. Hat stood alone in a narrow staircase, his swords drawn out as he looked towards the bottom. His eyes were narrowed down as he tried to get a clearer view of the darkness. Sadly, he had not yet mastered Shinsu sense, something that could be used to sense everything around oneself, a must-have ability for a scout. The two spear-bearers which had accompanied him had just recently tried to turn on him and use him as bait, for something they called their spear-bearer revolution. It went without saying that they stood no chance against him. However, just when he was going to teach them a proper lesson, he felt the rancor appear. Sweat poured from his forehead as he looked on in wait for the rancor. Swords were especially hard to swing in a high-density Shinsu area, meaning in an environment like the current one, Hats was fighting at best 40% of his true combat potential, a skill issue in accordance to him. Along with that, he wasn't completely sure about the skill level of the two spear-bearers he had instructed to lie in wait for an opportunity. If anything, they might choose to betray the team and run off. Hats tightened his grip on the sword, dispelling the thoughts out of his mind. All I can do right now is trust them, he vowed. His eyes looked on, waiting for the rancor to arrive. I thought he would be happy after taking care of Team A. But the waves of his fury are reaching me all the way here through the Shinsu. Lights to the front. He commanded the observer that rushed above him and cast its light to the front. Just then, something rushed out from down the stairs, climbing each step with frightening speed. Whoosh! Hat slashed with his sword, only to meet the air as the rancor ducked beneath it. Then, the rancor jumped towards him, throwing a fist at his abdomen which was blocked by his arm. Hats was pushed back, his arm badly bruised. The rancor didn't delay any longer, jumping ahead once more and throwing another punch at him, one that was again blocked by his arm. Then, making use of the opportunity, Hat slashed down with his sword towards the rancor, his sword cutting through the Shinsu in the air. Shah! Crack! A small straight crack formed in the stairs, his sword again not meeting its intended target. Wow! I knew you were strong in my class, but such skill is commendable, the rancor praised. But compared to Ari's swordsmanship, it's not too great, he lamented. As he spoke, a storm rapidly brew in Hats's head. He punched me with all his weight and stepped back to avoid my strike at such a close range. And all of that was done on the same foot, he thought grimly. I see. I understand. He grinned a bit as he looked on towards Quant. His movements aren't just exceptional for a human. No, this man in front of me. He's no longer a human. He is a different species than any other that exists in the tower. The rancor. The rancor is here, came Hats's voice from the lighthouse. Serena and Ho, who were sitting around in the darkness, immediately jumped in fright. Damn. He's here already? Let's go, Ho, Serena yelled as she began to run through the dark. However, just when she looked back, she couldn't find anyone. She looked around. Ho! The fisherman group walked along towards the exit, still traversing the second circle. Winston trotted along without saying anything. In his hand, he twirled a small coin, pale blue in color with frightening proficiency. Physical's currency in the tower was rare, at least in terms of dealing between regulars. Otherwise, it was plenty abundant in the middle and the outer tower. What he held was a silver coin, inland with 3% pure suspendium, something he had bought from Kun at the discounted price of 200 points. Winston smiled as he remembered the trade deal. With some research he had figured out that suspendium was especially pricey in all respects, no matter how impure it was. As such, the coin he held in his hands was of at least a value of 800 points. However, swindlers were indeed good at deception and trickery. Somehow, He had managed to cut off the deal to a measly sum of 200 points. He twirled in around his fingers, looking at Indorsey and Bam, who walked at the forefront of the group. Slowly, he drew in closer to listen in to their conversation. It wasn't anything worth Winston's benefits, only Indorsey telling Bam about her background, which, for some reason, the princess deemed right to be discusses in the middle of a test. Suddenly, as the princess was busy telling her story to the boy, a voice yelled out from the lighthouse. "Ranker found!" It yelled. The brawny man who was complimenting Indorsey looked at the lighthouse in alarm. "Ranker? Where? Close? No. He's near the swordsman and the two idiots." As the words landed, the man turned towards the princess with a big smile on his face. "You see, princess, the ranker is moving as expected. The plan is working perfectly," he exclaimed. Hearing his words, Winston suddenly felt a bad premonition. He stole a glance at Indorsey, who smirked at the news. "Yes, it's working perfectly," she said. Suddenly, she pulled out a red needle from her reel inventory and threw it out. The reel spun the needle around, making a large circle, about 10 meters in radius around her. The lighthouse which stood in the way was instantly pierced through, turning it off and isolating all contact with the rest of the team, engulfing their group in darkness. "The lighthouse! What are you doing?" the fisherman with a sword asked, his eyes narrowing dangerously. Indorsey's smirk widened as she said in a sweet and compassionate tone, "Anyone that leaves this circle henceforth will die." She chuckled. "Though you might die regardless. I am very moody after all." Winston smiled at her display, pleased that his previous guess had come to fruition. "Princess, you should stop playing around," the brawny man said, drawing closer to the princess. Just then, Indorsey kicked him in the chin, throwing him to the side, almost to the outside of the ring she had made. All the fishermen moving together in one place, all watching the ranker's movements. "Geez, are you people really so clueless?" she sighed. "That is the reason you all don't deserve to go up the tower." She shook her head. Chapter 30. Hide and Seek 6. Winston smirked at her display, feeling a bit amused. "And what of me?" Winston smirked, adding a mocking tone to his voice. "Princess?" He noticed how a vein threatened to pop on her forehead, but she didn't take any movements towards him. "You are the exception to this," she said. "Walk out if you want to. But don't get in my way." She scowled. Winston chuckled. Then, he put his hands on the back of his head and stretched his body. "You're surprisingly self-aware," he said. From the corner of his eyes, he saw Indorsey's grip on her needle tighten, yet she still didn't move. You plan to eliminate us from the beginning?" the man with the sword asked. The brawny man got up, blood flowing from his nostrils due to the kick he had received. "Correct." Indorsey smiled sweetly, turning her head away from Winston. "If you all get eliminated, oh look at that, there will be 5 fishermen left. The ideal grounds for me to pass." Indorsey chortled happily. "Ms. Indorsey, why are you doing this?" Bam yelled out from behind her. Suddenly, Winston, who was about to leave the circle and go about his way, looked back at him, seeing his nervous look. "So she did that to teach him a lesson, huh? She isn't normally so kind to do so. Perhaps she made a deal with Kun? Or, don't tell me she has a crush on Bam." Winston felt weirded out by his own thought process and stepped out of the circle without problem. He stepped out of the circle. "Look at him." As he did so, the brawny man yelled after him, calling out to Indorsey. Winston looked over his shoulder, his eyes finding Indorsey, who stood with a needle in hand. Then he smiled and said, "So are you really going to do anything, princess?" His tone was one of slight provocation. However, Indorsey didn't seem to be the one to be riled up through such provocations. As Winston had observed, one had to comment on her face of body to provoke her properly. Indorsey clicked her tongue in annoyance. "Someday, I will really punch that grin off of you. Sadly, it won't be today." Winston chuckled and walked along. He held up his hand and waved to them. "It's good to have dreams, princess. But best not make them unrealistic." Indorsey gnashed her teeth together as Winston eventually disappeared into the darkness. Somewhere along the line as he walked along, Winston heard a large explosive sound from the area Indorsey and the other fishermen were. What was that? Was it Bam's latent powers awakening? He joked to himself, not sure whether such a thing could happen or not. All things about Irregulars considered, Winston would not be too surprised to find out that Bam had somehow awakened a strange ability in the face of danger or stress. However ordinary the boy might seem to be, he was and will be an irregular. Someone that breaks the rules and laws of the tower. Winston shook these thoughts off his head and went ahead. Suddenly, an idea crossed his mind. He smiled. Let's just make this game interesting. I've been on the sidelines long enough, I feel. He popped his neck and stretched his arms above his head. Then, he summoned his pocket and looked at his position. I'm almost to the safe zone. Wasn't the seeker sighted close to the stairs that lead to the second circle? I wonder if I'll meet him on the way down, he muttered to himself. Then, he shrugged and took out the bright blue coin out of his pocket. I'll run into the ranker if I go to the safe zone. I'll run into the ranker if I go to the safe zone. He muttered the sentence in his mind 7 times, and then flicked the coin into the air. Ding! The coin spun in the air and landed right onto his palm. Heads. Winston smiled in anticipation. Then, he started running towards the safe zone. I have a question, Mr. Light. A voice echoed in the darkness. Winston stopped in his tracks as he heard the voice. He propped his body to the wall adjacent to him and peered over the corner, his dark vision allowing for perfect vision. Right at the edge of the safe zone, where the light-bearer, Michelle Light, was stood 2 humanoid figures. One of them held the other one in a choke grip, a blade at the other party's neck. The one at the blade point was a young girl with blonde hair and freckles, donning a dark brown cloak. Ho and Rachel? Winston narrowed his eyes, feeling some deeper story behind the current predicament. I wasn't expecting to encounter such drama. Who is Bam? That monster. Ho called out. Isn't it weird? How is he able to learn Shinsu so fast? Was he blessed or something? Ho's eyes took on a crazed look, his voice cracking with a crooked tone. Why are you so quiet? Tell me. He chuckled. Because you're holding out hand over her mouth. Idiot. Winston scoffed in his mind. What did God take from him in exchange for talent? I lost everything, and all I got was enough power to do some parlor tricks. Don't you think he deserves a bit of misery? At that point, Winston walked out from the corner. Who are you to decide that? His voice echoed in the surroundings, startling Ho, who was about to plunge the blade into Rachel's neck. Who's there? He screamed into the darkness. Winston smiled and slowly walked into the dim light cast by the non-functioning lighthouse. Mr. Winston? Ho's eyes widened a bit. I'll ask you again. Who gave you the right to decide whether Bam deserves misery or not? Winston asked, a smile still on his face. Hearing his words, Ho was surprised for a moment before he gave out a slight smile. What? Are you here to stop me from killing her? He smiled. Winston's eyes scanned Rachel, who was sweating profusely. Honestly speaking, I don't really care if you kill her or not. Personally. He scratched his head, feeling a bit annoyed. In his mind, the figure of a young boy flashed. But I guess I want to protect the strange innocence I was never able to experience. He droned. Ho raised an eyebrow. What are you talking about? He asked. Winston's eyes suddenly took on a piercing glare. Let her go. You failure of a wave controller, he said in a cold voice. Ho's eyes trembled slightly under his gaze as he took in the contents of his words. He gnashed his teeth. You. I see. So, you're also with that monster. Why are you supporting him? Don't you see what kind of a monster he is? Ho screamed, the saliva flowing out of his mouth. Monster. Winston scratched his chin, looking at him quizzically. That's right. Don't you see how fast he picked up Shinsu? Compared to everyone else, he's way too monstrous. What did he lose to gain that talent? I lost everything. I lost everything that I had ever known all my life, and I still can't do anything. Do you think that's fair? Ho screamed in unbridled rage, his eyes clouding over momentarily with wrath. Winston narrowed his eyes at him. So? He tilted his head. Wah. Ho looked at him quizzically. So what? Winston asked again. All I can deduce is the fact that you're blaming Bam for your own inability. Winston began to walk forward with slow and deliberate steps. Why are you so deep into your own shell of demean that you overlook everything? You say that Bam hasn't lost anything and he deserves misery? Who are you to decide that? All you're doing is imposing your own loss to someone else. Stop blaming others for your own circumstances. There is no one to blame for your loss, no one to look for to take responsibility. Your circumstances, your loss, it is yours, not anyone else's. Winston looked at him in pity. You're such a large failure that you would want nothing more than to cause misery to a naive boy? Get over yourself. You trash. Ho's eyes hook inside his sockets. The hand which held the blade began to tremble, appearing to be on the breaking point. Then, A single tear dropped from his eyes and slid over his cheek. You. He clenched his teeth. You know nothing. He pulled back the knife and held it behind Rachel's body. I will take from him what God didn't. I will do God's work and do this world a favor. He pulled back the knife, preparing for a strike. And just when Winston concentrated his spirituality and was going to cast freeze on the deranged failure of Irregular, a powerful voice boomed out from the darkness, seemingly coming from all directions at once. Ho stopped, and so did Winston. You will take for him what God didn't? A mere regular like you. Winston turned his head, gazing through the darkness at the red-haired ranker, Quant. You should know better. Quant smiled, walking into the light. Behind him floated a yellow-colored lighthouse. The god on this stage is me. Ho looked at the ranker, flabbergasted. How did you get here? He asked in disbelief. Then, his eyes took in the image of the lighthouse. You followed the lighthouse she left? Damn it. That was sneaky of her. Ho cursed in his mind. But why did the ranker follow the lighthouse? Winton also narrowed his eyes at the lighthouse that was behind Quant. Why would he follow the lighthouse, when the priority is within Dorsey, who could potentially escape? What the hell are you doing? Pointing a knife at your teammates? Quant asked, his voice conveying his annoyance perfectly. It doesn't seem like you're competing for the same position too. What do we have here? Winston suddenly felt a chill travel up his spine. The Shinsu around him seemingly waved and bubbled, traveling all around with the ranker as the focal point. That's dangerous. Winston's forehead was suddenly full of sweat. Something's not right. It's as if he already knew about my plans. Ho thought grimly. Damn it! Ho yelled, trying to dash back into the safe zone. At that moment, the ranker moved. In the span of the blink of an eye, the ranker dashed all the way to Ho, appearing right before him. However, just when he was about to hit him away, something dashed out from the side, targeting both the ranker and Winston. The ranker leaned back, dodging a bright red spear that was thrown at him, allowing Ho and Rachel to retreat back into the safe zone. Meanwhile, Winston sidestepped and extended his hand, and in the middle of the air, he grabbed the spear from the air. Winston looked at the perpetrators of the act, looking at the green-skinned spear-bearer, Pericule, and the other spear-bearer that accompanied them. What are you doing? Winston asked coldly. Pericule looked at his friend as if he was an idiot. Why are you attacking him? I told you to attack the ranker. Sorry. The other spear-bearer bowed his head towards Winston. Winston chuckled coldly, looking over towards the safe zone. Chaos isn't so bad, I guess. Maybe Mr. Fool was onto something. Chapter 31. Hide and Seek. 7. Winston looked at the two people who were tied up behind Pericule and the other spear-bearer. It was evidently they had taken hostages to put pressure on the ranker. Without wasting any time, the two spear-bearers hurriedly told Ho to collude with them, which he was happy to do. Mr. Quant, if you resist, I can't guarantee the girl's life, he said, his hand shaking in nervousness. Winston clicked his tongue and looked towards the spear-bearers. Annoying, he said. Then, his figure turned into an after image. His body, enhanced with Shinsu, dashed at full speed towards the spear-bearers who stood 80 meters away, reaching their position in a little less than a second. The spear-bearers, in a frenzy, tried to go for the two hostages, onto to freeze midway. Freeze spell of a trick master. Winston stopped in front of them and kicked them in the head, promptly knocking them out. Then, he looked over towards the ranker, who raised an eyebrow at his impressive display of speed. I was hoping to meet you. Winston smiled. Quant smirked. Is that so? Want to try your luck? Luck? That's a whole other domain. He chuckled. I prefer testing myself against destiny. That's more in my domain. Winston held the spear in his hand and took a combat stance. Quant looked at Ho, who stood pointing a knife at Rachel's neck. Are you really going to do this? Your teammate's life is at risk, you know, he asked. Winston looked over at Ho. Just then, as he was about to freeze Ho and free the girl, a voice called out from the side. Mr. Ho? What are you doing? With the voice, a young boy emerged, his figure covered in crimson. All these interruptions are getting annoying. Suddenly he shivered. Coincidences. Should I be wary of a certain quill? Winston joked in his mind, feeling a chill travel up his spine at the remembrance of the first volume of Lord of Mysteries. The first volume really triggered a lot of traumas of illogical things. A couple being pregnant woman and coincidences. With Bam's arrival, the situation turned awkward for Ho, who, at first, stammered over his words. Then, as Bam continued to question him and drew in closer and closer, Ho eventually began to scream at him, demeaning him for his talent and luck. Eventually, as things turned bad, Ho pulled back the knife and plunged it deep into Rachel's back. Rachel let out a muffled scream as Bam pulled back his steps in fright. "If you want her to keep breathing, stop those two," Ho yelled at him. "Hey, don't you think this has gone far enough?" Winston's voice came from behind Ho at the moment. Ho suddenly felt his hair stand on edge and he pulled back the knife in order to slit Rachel's throat. However, at the critical moment, he suddenly felt his blood turn cold. His movements slowed down and his body lost all its heat, turning as cold as ice. His eyes trembled as he struggled to make sense of the situation. A strong hand held the back of his hair and pulled him and, throwing his frozen body to the ground. Crash. Org. Ho let out a small scream in pain as he stabilized his body and looked back, only to see Winston towering over him. Sweat poured from his face as he looked into the almost dead and cold eyes of this demon. What are you?" he stammered. Winston didn't answer. Suddenly, he pulled back his leg and kicked Ho right in the face, causing blood to pour out of his nose and mouth. Then, Winston smiled at him. "Your plan has failed. Now stay put. We'll deal with you later," he said, and then he walked back towards the ranker, out of the safe zone. "Shall we begin now?" he asked with a smile. Quant chuckled. "Is that remote reverse flow control? It feels a bit different, but I can feel the shift in the Shinsu," Quant asked in intrigue. Winston smiled. "You can detect that?" "Of course. A great scout can always tell the subtle shifts in Shinsu." Quant nodded. "But your reverse flow control doesn't seem so refined. Want me to give you some tips?" He broke out with a toothy grin. "I certainly wouldn't mind them." Suddenly, Quant rushed straight at him, in his hands, a small ball of light gathering up. Winston prepared himself, the spear in his hand ready for combat. Just then, a vision rapidly surged into his mind. He saw Quant's palm touch his chest, the bong flowing into him, and then, all his movements ceased while Quant retreated back. Seeing the vision, Winston didn't do anything as Quant approached and slammed his palm into his chest. Quant raised a brow at Winston not dodging the attack and saw him smiling. Seeing his wide grin, Quant chuckled. "Regulars these days," he muttered and jumped back. "They keep getting crazier." Winston felt the Shinsu that flowed inside him turn chaotic and out of control, even his spirituality. And then, the Shinsu stopped. He felt his body freeze up and cease all kinds of movement, not even being able to move a finger. And then, with some effort, he seized control over his flow and got rid of the stiffness. "That bong I gave you, can you feel it?" Quant asked, to which Winston responded with a nod. Replicate the same flow in an attack using a singular bong. If done correctly, even a bong with only 10 su can freeze a regular for a few seconds. Though you recovered quite quickly, taking less than a second. Winston remembered the flow he felt inside his body, remembering the intensity through which it streamed through him. For some time, he experienced something breaking down inside him and fusing with his spirit to some extent. He smiled. "I think I got it." Winston looked back, feeling a gaze at the back of his head, and saw Dorsey walking towards them with the sword of the sword-wielding fisherman. Behind her, Bam laid sobbing while holding onto a bloodied Rachel, all while a lone body stayed on the ground, a knife sticking out of his chest. "He committed suicide?" Winston raised an eyebrow. At the corner of his eyes, he saw Serena, who had freed herself, walking over towards them, limping as she did so. He turned his attention to Dorsey. Winston smiled at her. Well, if it isn't the princess," he said. Dorsey smiled. "Shall we take the badge now?" she said, holding up her sword. "Take the badge? Just you?" Quant laughed. Finally, without a word, everyone involved took on a combat stance. Serena sat beside Ho looking at the three people that were getting ready to fight. Bam, who was kneeling beside Rachel, got up and looked towards the three figures. Serena stole a glance at Ho and her eyes held a sad expression. People lose their reason to live when they lose something they cherish. Serena looked at the battlefield again. "Doesn't like suck, Ho?" she called out, knowing that no one was hearing her. "The world doesn't care when I'm losing. But when I try to make others lose, it stops me. Isn't that unfair?" "Ho." Winston held the spear in his hand and dashed straight at the red-haired ranker. Dorsey took it as the signal and also dashed forward with speed not too inferior to that of Winston. Quant strode forward by a single step, getting too close to Winston for him to attempt a stab and not close enough to attempt a kick or a punch. Winston suddenly smiled and a bright light flashed in front of the ranker's eyes, causing him to close them. Trickmaster spell. Light. Dorsey, who was at the side, took advantage of the opportunity and slashed with her sword. Narumada. Ignition. She yelled. Then, a flux in the shinsu around them came. Winston jumped back in time, narrowly avoiding a large explosion of shinsu that came with the sword strike. Are you trying to catch me in the collateral? Winston smirked. Dorsey chuckled at his words. Are you going to be caught even? She inquired. Winston shook his head, looking towards the rancor again. Slamming his fingers together, he activated spirit vision to see the shinsu flow and read the rancor's moves. Actually, I can't remember a time where I had to fight seriously. I always made excuses, saying that the world was unfair. Winston's eyes widened imperceptibly, the same smile on his face still. The rancor walked out of the large dust cloud that had been made due to the shinsu explosion. His figure remained completely unscathed. You're tough, Winston commented. 400 years in the upper floors. The shinsu has stopped my aging and made my body tougher than steel. Quant laughed boisterously. Though I have to say, having to face an ignition weapon, especially in the hands of a jihad princess, wasn't something I was expecting. Without another exchange of words, they all dashed at each other. An explosion of waves happened in Winston's eyes, overlapping with his normal vision, outlining the next moves to be of everyone in his line of sight. However, Winston quickly noticed a problem. The shinsu. It doesn't seem to be moving as much with his body. Normally, as the body moves through the shinsu, waves outline the movement that will be followed. However, his case is a bit troublesome. The three engaged in a 2 versus 1 battle, their figures rapidly phasing about the battlefield. Freeze! Winston yelled in his mind, at the same time, casting the reverse flow control he had just learned. Quant stopped suddenly, his figure stuck in an awkward moving of jumping up from the ground. Dorsey moved forward without weight, quickly igniting the sword and slashing down towards the rancor. But then, I always regretted not having fought with my life on the line. Boom! Crash! Another bout of explosion happened, and with it, the rancor dashed out of the dust cloud right towards Winston. You're troublesome. I'll deal with you first, he yelled. Winston smirked. Just as Quant was about to reach Winston, he stopped and leaning back. Whoosh! A bong whirled past his face, smashing into the wall at the far end, leaving a football-sized depression. Quant looked sideways, where a bloodied and battered boy stood with his hand stretched towards him. Without giving him any time to think, Winston moved again. Freeze! And stop! Quant froze again, and with that, Dorsey dashed from behind and Winston from the front. What would have happened if I had taken the risk despite the dangers? What would have happened if I had at least tried? It might just have been a life full of losses, but my heart wouldn't have been so empty right now. I would have at least been happy. Quant, who was frozen, quickly seized control over his body again, an action that took a blink of an eye. Even Winston was surprised by his recovery speed. However, that time was enough for Winston to get right up and personal with him. They both engaged in a rapid fist fight. Dorsey slashed her sword at Quant. Both Winston and the Seeker ducked under it to avoid the hit. Then, Winston muttered something. I have a feeling she's more into targeting me and you. I felt the same as well. Quant agreed. For a moment, Winston was at a loss of words. He was only joking, but getting Quant's confirmation seemed to be a wake-up call. Tumble. Winston concentrated his spirituality and cast another one of the Trickmaster spells. Quant's footing trembled and he slipped forward. So we need to keep on living. Because eventually, in that long life that we have ahead of us, maybe, just maybe we'll be able to find something of meaning. Perhaps, we'll find 1 or 2 reasons to keep going, won't we? Like them. Quant slammed his hand into the ground, supporting himself up and throwing himself into the air. Just then, a beam of light impacted his back, throwing him forward. A bong of shinsu, thrown by Bam. Quant clenched his teeth. At the ground, Dorsey yelled out the name of her weapon again. Narumada. Ignition. Shinsu roared around the sword, as if given a strange consciousness that promised nothing but pain to all that touched it. Then, she swung the sword. A brilliant slash of light traveled through the air, going right at Quant, who still hovered mid-air. Just then, the shinsu around him reacted. It whirled around his body, the waves altering his posture mid-flight. In the blink of an eye, his body completely turned around in the air, avoiding the slash altogether. As he landed onto the ground, Quant suddenly felt his body freeze up. Got you, came the voice of Winston Heath. He dashed out as the maximum speed he could muster. As his hand was about to reach the badge, the rancor took control over his body, and his eyes turned to look at Dorsey, who stood some distance away. Without missing a beat, the shinsu around him reacted again, the waves piling about and facilitating his movements. Immediately, his speed, which was comparable to Winston, turned at least 3 times faster. Whoosh! His figure dashed right past Winston, leaving a trail of dust behind it, rushing straight towards the princess who held the badge. Suddenly, Winston smiled. Shahia! Fife Thay! The sound of a rope being drawn suddenly rang out, prompting Quan to stop in his tracks as he reached Dorsey. His eyes widened as he looked towards his coat. The badge silently hung to his cloak. However, slowly, it disappeared into a mystical illusion. He hurriedly looked back. Besides Winston floated his real inventory, atop which was a hook that held the badge of the ranker. With a smile, Winston spoke. Checkmate. With that said, he pressed the button. Serena quietly looked at them with sad smile. Then, she looked at Ho. Why did you have to die? When you have a full life ahead of you. She shook her head as her hand closed the still open eyes of Ho. Beep. Team A failed. Team B passed. Chapter 32. Talks. The hide-and-seek test ended in the victory of Team B and loss of Team A. After the test was over and the injured were escorted out, Winston could not help but notice the slightly despondent feeling everyone held on their faces, especially the bloodied boy, the 25th BAM. Winston shook his head, not understanding the source of their sadness. Winston looked on as Ho was carried off, and remembered the list the scouts were given. His eyes narrowed slightly. Then, he smiled. I suppose he was really so naive to take everyone as his friend. Winston's mind was suddenly filled with images of Amon, Zarin, and the other regulars he had spent time with on the test floor. He could not help but let his thoughts wander, thinking up the various possibilities the future may hold. Then, he closed his eyes and sighed. He felt the progress of his potion digestion, and finally his mood elevated to a certain extent. It seems even lying to the ranker about knowing reverse flow control was fine for the swindler potion to trigger digestion. Amid every single member of the B team, Winston was the only one that held a smile on his face. Winston struggled in his bed, rolling about the covers as the sunlight filtered through the partially closed curtains. He blinked for a few seconds before stretching and getting out of bed. Then, he suddenly heard a voice echo through the room. Mic test. Mic test. 1 2 3. Attention all regulars. This is Luro. Congratulations for making your way through the previous test. I'm sure all of you are very tired by taking the position test, but make sure not to stay in bed all day and have your meals. Because the tests are now over, the meals in the cafeteria are now free, so those that didn't eat as well to save points can let themselves loose. However, I will say, the food here isn't that great. As Luro continued to speak, Winston got up and stretched his slightly stiff joints. Then, he practiced some rough cogitation to focus his spirituality and materialized 2 bongs around him amid the announcement. The bongs floated around him in a circle, speeding up gradually. Winston closed his eyes and sat down cross-legged on the ground. Now to tell you the reason the announcement is being made, the results for the positioning test will be revealed today at 6 p.m. in the main hall. Kindly be present on time. Enjoy. With that, the announcement ended. Winston kept his eyes closed, not letting his thoughts wander. The 2 bongs around him sped up more and more, spinning around rapidly, even making a slight breeze in the room. Slowly but surely, a 3rd bong also began to form around him, joining the other 2. The 3rd was noticeably smaller than the other 2 at first, but it rapidly grew in size to match the other 2. Winston breathed out. With a small mental command, the bongs around him stopped immediately. Then, he got up and headed for the bathroom. Winston sat on the tables of the cafeteria, with Amon and Zarin to his sides. They all had lavish food plates on their table, eating without a care in the world. All 3 had full confidence for passing the test without trouble. Winston not only performed well, but had the highest number of points among the fishermen, not to mention Hex, who seemed to favor him. Amon, being the top 3 in the scout rankings for the test floor, along with performing well in the test against Quant, his position teacher. As for Zarin, he had already passed early, and he has made all the effort to rub it in both Winston and Amon's faces. Winston chewed on the eel meat, his eyes wandering about the room, spotting Dorsey and Kun, who were heading for the empty seats diagonally across from them. Winston quietly chose to eat his food, not bothering to call out to them. As both of them seated, they began to talk. I didn't know you were so ruthless, destroying all of your fellow fishermen like them. Kun droned with a chuckle. Weren't you the one who proposed that you will help me with my business? Dorsey raised an eyebrow. I was. Didn't you promise to keep Bam from meeting Rachel? Kun took another bite from the rice. Winston's ears perked up hearing this. So they did make a deal, So, in exchange for keeping Bam with her, Kun would help her in a business. Going up the next floor, I assume? Winston mused. I did. But I couldn't stop him. Dorsey chortled. Hearing her words, Kun got up immediately. You ruined everything, he said and went in his way, taking his food along with him. That was a disaster, Zarin said suddenly. Dorsey perked up, looking at the three of them. Were you listening around? Dorsey yelled at them. You aren't exactly subtle with how you talk, Amon said, taking a bite out of the eel meat. If anything, it seems like you just don't care who listens in. I'm surprised you didn't notice us, he said. That was the truth. In actuality, Winston even suspected that Kun purposefully chose the seat diagonally across from them because he wanted them to hear their conversation, for reasons unknown to Winston. As for why that could potentially be the case, he could not say. But there was one thing he knew for sure. It was the fact that Kun wasn't so immature or careless to have just anyone listen in to his conversation. Winston smiled, pleased at the cunning of the blur-haired young man. Are you all right, princess? Winston chuckled. Dorsey raised an eyebrow. Huh. What could be wrong with me? A princess of Jihad? She asked boisterously. Ye seem sad. You even have dark circles under your eyes. Zarin spoke nonchalantly from the side. Dorsey suddenly froze. What the hell are you saying? Did you say I have dark circles? I'll have you know I take great care of my sleep routine. Dorsey yelled in a blinded rage. Winston sighed, and so did Amon. Dorsey was too easily riled up. One had to comment only on her appearance or age. I don't know about the dark circles, but you do seem slightly despondent. Winston took a bite. You should smile more. Being all sad isn't gonna get you anywhere, he commented. Amon nodded at the side. That's right. At least with a smile, one can gain strength to face the challenges. Dorsey scoffed. Smiling in front of a challenge? Instead of that, I prefer to eat up whatever is bothering me. She shook her head and got up, picking up her plate alongside her. Then, she walked away from the table. She's definitely feeling off, Amon commented. Yep. Zarin expressed his agreement. With that, they continued to eat their food in silence and a bit of idle chatter. Winston sat in his room by himself, lost in thought. He looked at the time. 5:32 p.m. It was not too long before the test results would be out. With the test results out and Rachel being injured, wouldn't she be declared unfit for climbing and therefore fail the test? He mused. Then, he shook his head. Whatever happens between her and Bam, that is now their own concern. He concluded. He had made the effort to save Rachel because they were taking a test and she was his teammate. There was no other reason involved whatsoever. Or at least any that he was willing to name. He sighed. I'm hungry, he thought. Just then, a knock was heard on his door. He got off the bed and spoke. Come in. The door opened with a strange hum, revealing a young man with bright blue hair and dark blue eyes, adorning a plain white shirt and khaki-colored pants. Winston raised an eyebrow. Kun? He asked. Kun nodded. May I come in? Winston nodded and invited him in. Winston sat cross-legged on the bed while GodAUdiobook himself comfortable on the chair in front of it. So, what brings you here? Winston asked with a smile. Nothing in particular. Can't I just feel like seeing a friend? Kun smiled back. Winston chuckled. I might have believed you if it were any other time during the 1-month stay here. Winston gazed at him. But not after the small display you put up for us earlier today. You're here for something. You need something from me, he said. Kun didn't object. Then, I'll get straight to the point, he said, his eyes suddenly gaining a strange pierce. I want you to train Bam and aid us in something we will do. Winston raised an eyebrow at Kun's request. Train Bam? Aid you? How so? And more importantly, what do I get in return? Winston smiled, pleased at having the opportunity to swindle Kun again. Aside from Quant, Kun was the ideal person to swindle, solely because of his sharp mind. The greater the difficulty of swindling someone, the greater the feedback. Kun smiled mysteriously. The request is exactly as it sounds like. I want you to train Bam. As for the second part, it's a bit complicated. For a few seconds, Kun explained their next course of action that they had decided upon, and how he was to play a role in that. After the explanation was done, a short silence followed. And what do I get in return? Winston asked, the same smile never leaving his face. With a shrug, Kun chuckled. How does a needle from GodAUdiobook's personal treasury sound like? And along came his voice like the devil's whisper. Winston was stunned for a moment, his eyes widening imperceptibly. He was silent for a moment. Then, he smiled. That's a bit too less, don't you think? It seems even the devil has demons he's plagued by. Chapter 33. Results. There was banter between Winston and Kun for a whole 20 minutes about the price Kun would have to pay for Winston's help. Even Winston would admit without doubt that Kun was not an easy person to swindle anything of monetary value out of. But eventually, it seemed that the swindler potion won through it. Winston looked at the time. 5:54 p.m. He smiled and Kun as they both got up and shook hands. Pleasure doing business with you. Winston chuckled. Kun nodded in agreement. I look forward to cooperating with you. He smiled. At that moment, there was another knock on the door. Knock knock. Hey, come out. Zarin yelled from the other side. Mr. Winston. Let's go. And along came Amon's voice. Winston looked at Kun. Ready to commence, I guess? He asked. Kun gave him a devious smirk. Of course. With that, Winston, Amon, Zarin and Kun headed for the main hall of the mothership, where the test results were to be told. Two figures walked along a long hallway, both having a similar yellowish blonde hair. One of these figures wore a blue robe adorned with yellow embossing, while the other wore a white lab coat. It was the test director, Han Sung-yu, and the test administrator Luro Ro. As they walked, Luro Ro broke the silence. It's finally the time to give out the results for the last test. This time's regulars were really too good. Honestly speaking, I wouldn't want to drop any of them. Luro Ro chuckled. I suppose I've grown too fond of them. He smiled. Director. Yes. The dangers of the tower you mentioned before. Are there any among the regulars here? He asked. Han Sung glanced at him from the corner of his eye. Mr. Luro Ro. He spoke. Luro Ro looked at him, both continuing to walk still. Did I ever tell you about how tests were conducted before? He asked. Luro Ro shook his head. The tests on this floor used to be conducted in a similar format to that of the other floors. A more complex testing format was adopted after the incident with Fantaminum. Luro Ro's eyes widened a bit, looking at Han Sung-yu in surprise. You do know about Fantaminum's invasion of the Jihad castle, right? He massacred the best of Jihad's rankers. Everyone in the tower was shocked by the overwhelming power he possessed. Power that directly propelled him to the top of the tower's rankings. And then, there was Yuri Mazino. He also displayed monstrous powers, to the point that the group he created, Wulhaksong, is so strong that even the 10 great families fear them. Han Sung-yu chuckled. At that moment, the great rulers of the tower found out that the tower they cherished so much could crumble through the appearance of a greater power. If the individuals who were unsatisfied with the tower and individuals with mysterious power were to enter the tower, then the balance of power would crumble down. He shook his head. But what decides if someone is dangerous or not? If that someone needs to be weeded out at the test floor itself? Luro Ro questioned. Han Sung's smile widened just a tiny bit. That's what we determine here, Mr. Luro Ro. What better way to do that than a life and death struggle? What better way to gauge someone's threat level than to put that person into a competition where their own life and existence is at risk? Don't you think that's fair? If they can bear all of that and emerge victorious, it can be said that they're chosen by the gods and hence, are fit to climb. If they die in between, they were better off not attempting to climb in the first place. Han Sung laughed. In simpler words, the floor of tests is a massive sea wall, so save the tower from a turbulent tsunami. He said. They both reached a giant red door, beyond which lied the main hall. I don't really like that idea, Luro Ro droned. Is it really helpful to sort those out who might pose a threat to the rules of the tower? Isn't everything in the tower subject to change in the first place? He glanced at the director. An ocean without waves. Isn't that just a pond? He said. Rather than to die in slow decay, isn't it better to live fighting the waves? Han Sung was quiet for a moment. If you don't like it, you can quit, he said, making Luro Ro looked at him strangely. The tests on the test floor will carry on. Whether you give your approval or not, whether anyone is dissatisfied with it or not. It simply does not matter what anyone thinks. He shook his head. Luro Ro narrowed his eyes. Then, test director. Yes. What say you? Who in the current batch is dangerous to the tower? Luro Ro asked. Han Sung chuckled. I can count a couple. He hummed, pinching his chin between his thumb and index finger. But if I had to name a few, I suppose Anak Jihad, and that small miserably boy. What was his name? Bam. He laughed. Oh, and I almost forgot. He shook his head. That fisherman. Winston Heath. With that, Han Sung opened the doors and walked into the hall. With a heavy expression on his face, Luro followed. Winston walked into the hall alongside Kun, Amon and Zarin. His eyes wandered towards every regulars that sat around. Most of them held a nervous expression, some even chewing their nails. Winston shook his head and walked to a free bench along with Zarin and Amon. As for Kun, Rak and Bam seemed to have saved him a seat. "Excuse me? Did the crocodile grow smaller?" Winston asked with a dumbfounded expression. His eyes were a bit unfocused as he looked on towards the chibi figure of Rak, who had shrunk to 1/3 his original size. At that moment, Zarin spoke up. "That's right. He said the test director did this," he exclaimed, which made Rak turn to him with a pissed snarl. Then, Amon commented, "Though most regulars that are too big to move around comfortably will choose to willingly shrink themselves down through the floor guardian's permission," he said. Winston nodded in enlightenment. As they sat down on their seats, the doors to the front, right beside the giant screen opened up, revealing two figures walking in. It was Han Sung-yu and Luro. Luro stood at the podium while Han Sung sat down on a chair behind a table, calmly sipping tea from a teacup he had managed to somehow conjure up. "Good afternoon, regulars," Luro began. "Starting now, I will announce the results of the position test," he exclaimed. And with that, the screen behind him lit up suddenly, showing pictures of the regulars that had passed, based on their respective positions. Among the regulars, someone gulped in nervousness. Fisherman, Winston Heath, Anak, Indorsey, Death Ryan, Injured, Failed, Chanhua Hong. Spear Bearers, Ghost, Rak Wraithrazor, Zarin Zalasakale, Pericule. Scout, Shibisu, Hats, Amon. Light Bearer, Kunagwiri Ugnis, Michelle Light, Injurer, Failed, Levin. Wave Controller, Fonsicle Lore, the 25th BAM. A wave of exclamations washed over the regulars. Some exclaimed in happiness and relief that they had managed to pass, while the other exclaimed in regret and disbelief, some even in anger that they had failed. One regular in particular was especially vocal about it, who was Pericule's acquaintance who had partaken in the Spear Bearers Revolution with him. Because of that, the test director, Han Sung-yu, got up from his seat and walked to the center of the podium. Then, extending his hand, he called him to the stage. The regular walked to the stage amidst everyone's stares. Winston activated his spirit vision, having a feeling that something interesting was about to happen. As the regular climbed onto the stage, Han Sung-yu challenged him to get off without losing his mind. The price was him passing the test. Just then, his shoulder snapped. "Arg!" He screamed in pain as he fell onto the ground, clutching his shoulder. Winston's eye widened as he felt the Shinsu close to the test director roar and twist in unnatural patterns. The waves around him seemed to turn almost ferocious, relentlessly rushing into the regular's body, shredding it from the inside. "Arf! My leg!" The regular screamed again, crawling desperately to get off the stage, tears going down his cheeks. "Arg! My balls! Not my balls!" he yelled suddenly, before passing out from the pain. Nobody spoke for a few moments. Winston's eyes remained wide opened, overlooking the strange waves that the Shinsu moved. A smile was plastered on his face. "So this is the sliver of a ranker's power," he thought. The hall was quiet for a moment before Han Sung spoke. "Is there anyone else dissatisfied with the results?" he asked, throwing a casual glance at all the regulars. Every regular that hadn't passed the test suddenly felt themselves tremble unknowingly. No one was willing to speak out, lest they met the same fate as the regular before. "Damn!" Winston heard Zarin mutter from the side. Then, as Han Sung was about to head back, a lone hand propped itself up, and a voice called out, "I am dissatisfied with the test results." Everyone looked over towards the speaker, finding none other than Kun, the cunning young man standing in his seat. Kun held a smile on his face as his eyes met that of Han Sung's. "Sigh." A tired sigh escaped from Han Sung's mouth. "Please come up here," he said. Amon, who was beside Winston, suddenly whispered to him. "What could he be trying to do?" he asked. Winston shrugged his shoulders, shaking his head as he did so. "I don't know. I can't tell what's going on in that devious mind of his." Amon looked towards the stage again. Kun slowly walked over to the stage, both his hands in his pockets. "What were you dissatisfied about? You passed, didn't you? Don't tell me you want me to fail you?" Han Sung asked with a tired sigh. Kun shook his head. "No. What I have a problem with is Michelle Light. I want her to pass on to the next test." "Michelle Light? But she's one of your competitors, isn't she?" She's important to my friend. Kun smiled. Han Sung went quiet for a moment before he burst out into laughter. I'm sorry, I didn't take you to be able to make any friends, he said. Kun didn't mind his comment, only looking on for his reply. But she's injured, Han Sung said. By the rules of the tests, she cannot partake in the next test and hence cannot pass. Kun's devious smirk seemed to widen at that moment. That's right. That's why I will take the administrator's test. He continued as a wave of surprise and horror washed over both the regulars and the position teachers who were seated to the right. I heard that although the supervisors carry out the tests now, the administrator has the supreme authority over any test. The rules can be changed as per his discretion. That's right. Han Sung nodded. So, I'll take the administrator's test and get permission for Michelle Light to join the test. Han Sung was quiet for a moment. Since you know all that, you must also know why everyone doesn't take that test, right? He asked. It's because the test is too difficult for everyone else. Though I don't think it'll be a problem for me. He chuckled. You're very cocky. But that's not the only reason people don't take the test. Han Sung continued. The real reason is because there is a requirement. As he said this, there was silence in the hall for a moment. Requirement. The requirement for taking the administrator's test is that, like Jihad and Yuri Mazino, you have to be an irregular. A large smirk made its way onto his face as he whispered in a voice that echoed throughout the hall. Winston cringed, seeing Kun's plan fall apart so easily. Well, can't say he didn't try. He shook his head in disappointment. Too bad there's no way I'm going to reveal myself, or even. Winston's thoughts stopped for a moment. He looked at Bam from the corner of his eye. Actually, he might just do that. He thought. Han Sung instructed Kun to go back to his seat. However, just at that moment a voice boomed out in the hall. Wait! Everyone's eyes turned to the figure of a young boy. The 25th Bam. I'll take the test. He yelled. Mr. Bam, did you not hear me? Han Sung raised an eyebrow. However, Winston noticed a curious thing in his spirit vision. The test director. He seemed almost happy? What is this? It doesn't matter. Bam yelled. Because I'm an irregular. With that, Winston saw Han Sung use emotions turning, getting happier and excited. He narrowed his eyes. Something's not right. Chapter 34. Administrator's Test. I felt something was wrong with Bam. But I didn't guess that he was an irregular. Shibisu spoke, breaking the silence among the regulars that stood around the stage. Bam's confession came as a surprise for everyone. No one had suspected him for being an irregular, except for Winston, who had all but concluded the fact already. After Bam's confession, Han Sung-yu agreed for him to be able to take the administrator's test and sent him to meet the floor administrator. As for the rest of the regulars, Han Sung gave them a choice. Either take the test with Bam, or take the next test separately. Even if one could pass the administrator's test, that would entail that they had helped an irregular go up the tower. If they didn't, it would probably result in Bam's failure, as no one would be able to assist him in the test. Excuse me. A small girl with a backpack raised her hand. What's an irregular? And why is everyone so surprised? She asked. Shibisu replied, an irregular is someone that isn't chosen to climb the tower. They open the gates by themselves and arrive into the tower. They are considered dangerous, as every time an irregular arrives into the tower, chaos has followed. They are all known to possess strength beyond that of any regular. The small girl nodded in enlightenment. Then, she turned her head towards the others and asked, then, what should we do? Pericule, who stood quietly, spoke up. Of course we won't help. We can't ruin our lives to bring some girl up. What has he done for us anyway? Pericule yelled, think about it. It'll be insane to help him. Don't you agree? Just when the others were about to speak up, a singular comment shut everyone up. Yeah, I agree. Everyone's eye turned to Kun, who stood with his head lowered. His eyes couldn't be seen, hidden by his hair. Winston smiled, seeing his calm and collected emotions. I feel sorry for Bam, but I can't help an irregular. Oh Kun. Even now, manipulating people to your liking. Winston shook his head with a smile. Hats turned to Kun and snarled. Kun. You sick piece of crap. He yelled. How can you say that? I don't like it either, okay? Kun yelled back. But it can't be helped. If it gets out that I helped an irregular, I'll be ruined. I might even get expelled from my family. Hats gnashed his teeth in anger. However, just as he was about to move, a rough sound rang out. Crash. Kun fell down onto the ground, his lip bleeding crimson. Everyone looked in surprise towards the small crocodilian creature that had smashed its head right into Kun's face. "What the hell are you doing, you crocodile?" Kun yelled. Rak looked down at him, his eyes filled with unbelievable contempt. "Look at you turtles, cowering beneath your shells in fear," he said. "That's why you're nothing but a turtle. You're too afraid to hold your heads up." Kun propped his upper body up from the ground, taking support with his arms. "You don't know what you're talking dash. I don't care. The black turtle is my prey, so I'll follow him," Rak declared, his voice echoing through the hole. "You turtles keep cowering inside your own shell. I'm following him. I don't want to lose my prey," Rak yelled and began to walk out of the hole. As he closed the doors behind him, Winston walked forward. "I'm going with him as well," he said, making everyone look over to him. His eyes scanned Kun, who was sitting on the ground with a guilty expression. Winston's eyes were clear as he said with a strange smile, "I don't think anyone would want to be with a cowering traitor that betrays his friends to keep his family name." He shook his head. Zarin held his hands behind his head and turned his head. "I agree. Let's go." With that, all of three of them began to walk out. As they did, many other regulars also followed. Anak, Shibisu, Hats, Indorsi and everyone else that was in the room, even Pericule at the end. Everyone left, leaving Kun laying on the ground at the end. Kun looked towards the ceiling, lost in thought. His eyes were slightly glazed over, appearing a lighter shade of blue than normal. Then, a voice sounded from the side. "Hey, turtle." Kun's eyes turned to the speaker, finding Rak standing with his arms crossed. "Stand up. All the other turtles are joining the test," he said. Kun, with a smile, stood up and said, "You're pretty intuitive, Rak." Rak's maw adorned a strange smile that looked more menacing than happy. "I'm the only crocodile that knows what's inside the shell," he said. Kun smiled in response as he looked on towards Rak. He could not help but reminisce about the moments they had spent together. "You know, you just called yourself a crocodile," he said with a chuckle. What? "No, I didn't. I'm Rak Wraithrazor." Kun laughed, making Rak fume in annoyance. However, as he watched on for a few seconds, he too began to chuckle. Then, both began to laugh together. A sweet melody of a deep friendship, reverberating through the test floor. Winston stood alone in a hallway of the mothership. His eyes were lying in wait, looking around the corner of the path where a door stood. After some time, the door opened up and out walked a young man with short brown hair. The young man didn't notice him and walked forward without issue. "You should be more aware of your surroundings," Winston chuckled. The young boy jumped in surprise and looked back. "Ah, Mr. Winston." He scratched the back of his head. Winston smiled. "Everyone will be joining in on the test with you. You can rest assured." Bam's eyes widened a bit in surprise. "Really? That's great." Winston walked towards him, prompting Bam to walk along. Their footsteps were the only thing heard in the hallway for a few moments. "Everyone was pretty shaken up about you being an irregular," he said. "Is that so?" Bam's face held a rare expression of regret. "What about Mr. Kun and Rak? They were too in some ways. But they were the ones that didn't take any time to consider following through with you." Bam heaved a sigh of relief. Winston quieted down again for some time, before speaking out again. "Bam." Bam looked at him. "Are you really sure about this?" Winston's eyes met his, a strange smile still on his face. Bam nodded in resolution. "I am. The tower doesn't take well to irregulars entering it. You could very well be in for a world of pain. It doesn't matter. Because I will take Rachel to see the stars." He nodded. "But is it even worth it?" Winston asked, tilting his head. "Are the stars worth risking your life over? Is that girl worth risking your existence on? Is she worth all of that importance you place on her?" Bam nodded again. "She is." Winston sighed. He looked at Bam again. "What if the stars aren't as beautiful as they say? What if what's up there doesn't satisfy you?" "It doesn't matter. Because Rachel will be there with me. You're like a lost puppy. You wouldn't get anywhere with that attitude. Maybe. But I will make it work." "How?" Bam went quiet for a moment. "I will. Somehow." Winston's eyes narrowed at him. He was unsure of what to say next. He wasn't sure why, but the boy's overdependence on the girl was sure to cause some problems down the line. It didn't matter what or how, but it was surely going to cause some. That was what Winston felt from his intuition. And one thing was for sure, anything Winston's intuition told him, he would follow through with it. Eventually, Winston nodded. Then I say good luck to you, he said, motioning Bam to keep walking. Bam nodded and walked away without another word, except for a particular phrase. Thank you, he said. Winston stared at his back for a few more moments, the same smile on his face still. The stars. He remembered how Bam rushed towards Rachel in the hide-and-seek test, his face enveloped by confusion and fear. Fear of losing the person most important to him. I suppose you already have your star. Winston reminisced about the sky. The thousands of colors, pale-colored dots littering the sky, covering the black canvas in an ocean of light through which occasional pieces of black space peeked through. He remembered himself trotting through lands, barefoot for miles and miles, looking for a place to find food and shelter amid the watchful eyes of the stars. He looked over again. Bam had already disappeared at the edge of the hallway. Winston's thoughts were a mystery. With Bam getting the permission of the floor administrator to take the test, along with the agreement of every other regular to take the test alongside him, the last test for the test floor was to be conducted 2 days after. Within this day, the regulars were to recover and train for the test, getting ready for it. Within this time, Winston got better acquainted with his mystical powers and the abilities Shinsu provided him with, getting stronger overall. He had already tried using ritualistic magic to pray to himself, and the results were also somewhat satisfactory. The first thing he noticed was the fact that Maxithian could indeed be used to trigger the power of nature around the user, and could be substituted for Hermes and Ancient Hermes, or any other mystical language in Lord of Mysteries. The second thing he noticed was the fact that ritualistic magic was made stronger through Shinsu around him, allowing for an increase in efficiency and decrease the expenditure of his own spirituality. And finally, the Shinsu around him could be substituted for the spirit world of Lord of Mysteries. He had already had some doubts about it from the moment he had first activated spirit vision, but now, his doubts had been made clear after the use of ritualistic magic. But there were still obvious differences between the two. Spirit world and Shinsu in the tower were completely different domains. One was a different aspect of reality that transcended the very concept of spatial dimension, while the other transcended reality in some forms. Spirit world houses creatures of various forms and could be used to travel in the blink of an eye, while the Shinsu does all of that and more pretty commonly all over the tower. There were also a lot of differences to name, but all of them were crossed by the utilization of Shinsu. There was nothing the spirit world accomplished that the Shinsu could not. The resource seemed almost omnipotent. This made Winston conclude one thing. The Shinsu was not, in fact, synonymous with the spirit world, but only acted as such because he needed it to. It perfectly fulfilled the role of the spirit world in terms of both ritualistic magic and divination, along with the empowerment of even mundane language like Maxithian, allowing it to blaze up with power of nature. Shinsu truly was a power source that could be described as limitless. It also made him conclude a very important question he had since arriving in the tower. The difference between spirituality and Shinsu. Honestly speaking, there was no conceivable difference, solely because Shinsu could simply act as spirituality and more. In fact, it had somehow managed to transform his spirituality to mimic its own properties, making it stronger. That was the reason there were no differences to name in case of spirituality and Shinsu. Chapter 35. Submerged Fish Hunt. The Submerged Fish Hunt? Zarin said, looking at Hansung with a raised brow. Hansung nodded. At the moment, all the regulars that had agreed to take the administrator's test were standing in a room. Hansung Yu and Luro Ro stood in front of them, explaining the rules of the test. That's right. You have to hunt the submerged fish and catch them. Hansung spoke. At that moment, Rak exclaimed, "Ha! Hunt some fish? That's my speciality." Indorsi and Anak also expressed their expertise, remembering all the training with the real inventory. Winston stood quietly, listening on to the explanation of the test. "Sorry to burst your bubble, but you won't be the one hunting the fish," Hansung said, instantly making the regulars stop talking. "That's the header's job." He pointed behind him where a picture of a black seal-like creature was kept. The creature had bright sea-green eyes and a layer of fur on its neck of the same color. "That's the herd fish? It's kind of cute." As always, the reactions were variable. "The name of this fish is the goby dolphin, also known as the chaser," Hansung explained. The picture behind him changed to now display a strange creature, eerily resembling an elongated jellyfish. At the center of this down hole is the queen of the goby dolphins. And beyond this hole lies another hole filled with water. Below the deeper hole lies a small tunnel that connects the structure to underground waters. At 10 a.m., the water level rises, and at 5 p.m., it drops due to changes in the tunnel water. Due to the structure's shape, we call it the wine glass. Hansung smiled. When the wine glass is full of water, the fish will gather here. That's when it's meal time for the queen. The goby dolphins can weave a net of shinsu in the water, and when the wine glass is full they will stand around in a circle that will start to narrow. Eventually, the net will reach the mouth of the queen and it will feed. Winston spoke out, "That's how the goby dolphins hunt. But what's our role?" Han Sung nodded. "What your role is to protect the goby dolphins?" "Protect?" Shibisu asked. "That's right. You need to protect the net until Bam and Rachel, who have become fishes, can reach the queen." Become fishes? What do you mean?" Bam's voice came with a stutter. "When the test begins, you both will be placed in a shinsu bubble that will be placed in the big circle. When the herding begins, the bubble is designed to move along with the shinsu net weaved by the goby dolphins. Your goal is to reach the queen's mouth and come out through the other end. Don't worry, the bubble is especially made to withstand the digestive juices of the queen." Winston raised his hand. "Then what do we have to protect the dolphins from?" he asked. Han Sung grinned. "The goby dolphins are not without their natural predators." The screen behind him changed again, now displaying a strange humanoid monster with a lizard-like mouth. It stood around with a worm-like organism, orange in color. "The first is the thief," he said. "Its real name is the barnacle goblin. They don't eat the dolphins, but they steal the fish that the goby dolphins have herded. The worm that they grow can extend its mouth freely. It can extend its mouth through the shallow soil and scoop up water from the wineglass, bringing along the fish with it." His eyes looked across the regulars. "The thieves get the fish by cutting open their stomachs. If Bam and Rachel are caught by them, everyone will fail the test." The screen changed again, now displaying a pig with dark brown fur on its body, stripped by lighter shades of brown. "Their enemy is the dog. Its real name is the striped earth pig and it eats the goby dolphins. Because of that, it does not get along with the thieves." The screen changed yet again, this time displaying a silhouette of a humanoid entity with a long tail behind it, and what looked to be a needle-like appendage that it held in its hand like a weapon. "The bull. It's a strange creature that dominates this ecosystem. It's named as so because of its ferocious nature and bad temper. Some time ago, some regulars ran into it by mistake and were all eaten." Han Sung narrowed his eyes and smiled at the regulars. "If the bull wakes up and decides to go on a hunt during the test, things will become very dangerous for you all," he said. Winston nodded. "Seems easy enough to understand." He smiled. Han Sung chuckled. "Then let the submerged fish hunt begin." Winston walked through a cave-like structure, the overhead rocks connecting down through gigantic pillars that held them up. One side of the cave structure was open to the outside, making the light filter through the air, dimly lighting up the entire area. Winston held a rare expression of annoyance on his face. Amon had been assigned with hats to keep an eye on the barnacle goblins, while Zarin was with the other spear-bearers, stationed up top in order to impale the worms when given the signal. Kun was in his lighthouse overlooking the entire test, while Shibisu was stationed in another part of the cave, on the lookout for both the thieves and the bull. As for him, well, shut up you freaky eyes. Who are you calling freaky eyes? You vertically compromised jerk. He was stationed with Anak and Indorsi Jihad, the two princesses of Jihad, and standing in station for the possible invasion of the bull into the wineglass. He looked back to see them still arguing. Among the two, Indorsi seemed to be the better one at insults. The only thing Anak had on her was the fact that Indorsi was easily riled up by comments on her appearance. Though Indorsi was also not too great at throwing insults. She was just better than Anak, which wasn't too high of a wall to cross. "Would you two shut up already?" he said with a pissed smile, the corner of his mouth almost twitching. "Almost. You stay out of this. This is between us." The two princesses shot at him with scowls on their faces. Winston shook his head with a resigned sigh. For a moment, he even felt like knocking them out after casting freeze on them, or making them fall repeatedly by casting tumble over and over again. But he decided against it. Infighting was something he wanted to avoid in a test, though the offer was always tempting. "Winston, any updates?" Kun's voice came from the floating pocket near him. "Why did I have to be with these two idiots? Shibisu would have been much better company," he said with a hushed tone, not wanting to alarm the two princesses and have them shouting at him. He didn't think he would lose in a battle of provocation. As he said, he didn't wish to engage in a fight as of now. "Well, it can't be helped. If the bull appears, you guys would be the only wall between the dolphins and it," he said. Winston shook his head. "It would have made sense to spread us out more and have us operate individually. With our speeds, if anyone spotted the bull, we could have rushed there on the moment's notice." He sighed. "We can't be underestimating the bull. It is an unknown variable, and it can't be assumed that any of you wouldn't be injured by the time the other two get there. Besides, the greatest chance for the bull to appear is by the site where the dolphins dive into the wineglass. That's why you're all near that area, Kun explained. Of course, Winston knew about that. He was just feeling wrong about being grouped with the princesses. He didn't know why, but he just did. Heh, is it my intuition warning me? He joked. Whatever, he said. Kun went quiet for a moment before his voice boomed from the pocket. Everyone. Bull spotted. It's near Shibisu's position. Head there immediately. Kun yelled. Winston's expression, along with that of the princesses, immediately turned serious as they all collectively began to rush in a direction. Their footsteps echoed in the moderately dark cave. It's so beautiful. It feels as if we've really become fishes. Rachel droned as she looked on towards the waters in which schools of fishes floated. Hundreds of fishes shone with a strange gleam in the shinsu. Meekant then appear like magical lights in the dark water. Rachel sat with her back supported by the frame of a bed. She laid there, unmoving, her legs enveloped by the bed sheets. Bam stood behind the bed frame, silently looking on towards the water. His eyes were unfocused, seemingly lost in thought. Ever since I came here, he thought. It feels like a strange force is flowing into me. He looked down and clenched his fist. It feels weird. He narrowed his eyes. Just then, he heard Rachel gasp. He turned back. What happened? He asked. Rachel pointed upwards towards the water surface, where strange movements seemed to be happening as holes drilled into the water. The thieves are moving, Bam exclaimed. It was a strange place. On a precipice stood a variety of people, one of them giant, one dwarf, and a boisterous-looking young lady. There were about 6 people in the group. All looked down from the precipice towards the abyss it held. So, I just have to jump from here to get into the regulars testing area, right? The lady asked, her red eyes shining strangely. That's right. The sliver-haired dwarf next to her scratched his head. The lady looked back and said, I recall telling you to lead the way, but I don't remember saying I want to go to hell, Evan. She said distastefully. The silver-haired man, Evan, flailed his hands around. It's not my fault. This is the only way to get to the testing spot without getting caught. I know it looks more like a cliff thought, but every other way we could have potentially gotten caught by Evankel, he said. But didn't you previously say Evankel wasn't on the test floor for the time being? She asked. That doesn't mean there are no observers. Being a ruler of a floor comes with its perks. Evan shrugged. The lady nodded. Then I guess we have no choice but to go from here, she said. Suddenly, her eyes held a mischievous glint. Then, she kicked Evan in the back, throwing him off the precipice. You go first, she said offhandedly. Aerf! You crazy princess! He yelled as he disappeared into the abyss. The other members of the team sweat dropped. There wasn't a sound of him hitting the ground. The fall's quite deep. The lady nodded. Chapter 36. Submerged Fish Hunt, 2. A guttural roar echoed throughout the caves, following along with a crazed scream. Help! Somebody help! Please! Shibisu yelled as he ran as fast as his legs could carry him. Behind him was a large behemoth colored in red and black. It was a strange creature, humanoid in shape with a tapering tail behind it. From its head extended another appendage that it held in front of it, the top of which holding a small light. Its maw was vertical in alignment with the rest of the body, appearing odd, and it held a strange spear-like object in its hands, something that was an extension of its tail. Roar! The roar of this strange creature seemed alien to anything one may try to associate it with. Unlike any other roar that could traditionally be recognized by a normal man, the creature extended its maw, wanting to bite off Shibisu's head. Wait! Let me tell you something. Let me tell you something. He yelled, narrowing, dodging the bite. Then, the tail of the creature, as if possessed or with a life of its own, moved to wrap around Shibisu's tail and lifted him off the ground. Crash! The bull slammed him right back into the ground with a large sound. Cracks spread over the ground as his eyes momentarily lost their luster. Then, just as the creature was about to open its jaws again to gnaw on his face, it stopped, as if frozen in time. Shibisu said dumbfoundedly, looking at the creature that was shaking slightly, as if trying to break out of a binding. Just then, a voice called out from the side. You okay? The voice said. With an imaginary tear in his eye, Shibisu looked towards the right, where a peculiar man with dark hair stood tall. The man had a relaxed disposition and a smile on his face. W. Winton. My savior. You're way too happy to be saved. At least pronounce my name correctly. Winston shook his head and chuckled. The bull wasn't too hard to freeze. Although it could break free within 30 seconds, he just had to cast reverse flow control again. And along with the Trickmaster's freeze spell, the deadline was extended to a whole minute. Winston himself was very pleased with his rate of progression. Such strength might not have arose if not for the digestion of his Sequence 8 potions, enhancing his talent further and making the spells stronger. I'm sorry for pronouncing your name wrong. Shibisu yelled as he broke free from the bull's grasp and ran towards him, his arms spread out as if wanting to embrace the world within them. Winston didn't dodge, letting Shibisu hug him. However, after about 3 seconds, it became awkward. Aren't you getting too comfortable? He said with a displeased tone, the smile still on his face. However now, the smile held a slight edge. Sorry. Shibisu backed off without a word. Then, his eyes shone suddenly. Winston! He yelled. Yes. Can I call you my son from now on? No way in hell. Shibisu slumped his shoulders. Then, voices came from behind them. It was 2 feminine voices arguing over each other. They're here, Winston said. With that, 2 beautiful-looking young women walked out from the dark, their eyes locked in a crazed battle and their mouths constantly moving in tandem to throw insults at each other. Stopping for a moment, they looked over towards the frozen bull as well as Winston and Shibisu. See? I told you he would take care of it. Dorsey shook her head, throwing a glance at Anak. You just don't want to move your heavy body. Anak scowled. Who are you calling fat? Dorsey yelled. Did I say fat? Your words, not mine. Winston and Shibisu both deadpanned at their display. Winston. Yeah. I'm glad you came with them. Somehow me too. Both of them breathed out, feeling annoyed at the princesses. Although the duo was supposedly their strongest, save for Winston, they could not work together at all. Roar. The bull broke free, regaining the command over its body. Immediately, it rushed straight towards the biggest threat it could feel, Winston. Freeze. The bull stopped again, its body in an awkward motion of going in for a bite, the spear it held in its hand also ready to be thrown. It's easy to freeze a target like this. Winston smiled. Indeed. When one could make 3 bongs, reverse flow control could turn the tides of the battle in an instant. Shibisu called Kun from his pocket. Kun, the bull has been neutralized. It won't cause a problem anymore, Shibisu said. Kun from the other side breathed a sigh of relief, glad that the princess duo hadn't somehow messed everything up. It seems sending in Winston with them was a good idea. Kun nodded to himself, sitting in the lighthouse. Shibisu chuckled. The princesses continued their useless banter while Kun provided them with a status report of the rest of the team. The herders had started to move, while the thieves had started their own shenanigans. The worms, it seemed, had already begun to drill into the soft dirt to steal the fishes. When the herding begins, the flow of Shinsu would automatically guide the fishes, and possibly Bam and Rachel right into the worm's stomach, thereby failing the test. And where are the dogs? 70% of the paths have been blocked. They might encounter each other any moment, Kun explained. The idea behind the test was simple. The little girl they had with them was an anima user, and using Lore's help, they would find the burrows of the dogs and crash them, eventually drawing them towards the thieves and causing conflict. With that done, the spear bearers would impale the worms from above and eliminate all chances of failure from the equation, securing a victory. Feels like a perfect plan. Almost too perfect. Winston mused, still feeling a bad premonition in his head. He looked over towards the bull, who had been frozen for the 7th time. Winston narrowed his eyes at the beast, feeling a bit unsure about it. Isn't it a bit too weak? He scratched his head. Just then, Anak and Dorsey came forward towards him and proposed something. A short game they could play while they wait for their victory. The prospect was quite simple. Each one of them would take 5 minutes to battle the bull. Whoever could kill the bull first would win the game, and could request something that the other 2 had wagered from them. Anak had already bet the Black March to Dorsey, while Dorsey had bet her freedom to Anak. Hearing their words, Winston immediately shook his head. No chance, he declared with a stern expression. The smile on his face, which seldom left, was absent. Why? They both screamed. Winston continued to look on with an uninterested expression. There are several reasons, but I won't bother explaining them to you. Now run along and argue with each other. Shoo! Winston waved his hand, shooing them away. With that said, the princess duo both had a vein pop on their heads. Their eyes held murderous intent. If looks could kill, Winston felt that he might be dead 10 times over by now. You're a mood killer. Dorsey poked her tongue out to him. And you're an idiot. Dorsey froze as she was going back to stand at the side. Anak snickered. Damn. Shibisu sweat dropped at the side. Dorsey mechanically turned her head back, a strange smirk on her face. What did you just say? She said calmly. Winston raised an eyebrow. You're stupid, he said. Wait, no. I said you're an idiot, not stupid. I mean, it doesn't really matter since they all mean the same. He scratched his chin. Dorsey clenched her fist. At that moment, Winston suddenly felt weird. Why? Am I provoking her? He wondered, his eyes widening a tiny bit. A strange premonition again welled up inside his heart. However, as he was contemplating, a vision overlapped with his senses. He saw himself getting punched right in the face, his body sliding back several meters. Winston ducked without a second thought. Whoosh! A punch passed above his head, making a whistling sound as it did so. Winston looked above. Dorsey stood in front of him, her arm outstretched. What are you doing? He asked, having already cast the freeze spell of lesser intensity. Just then, a roar interrupted his thoughts. He hurriedly turned his head, finding the bull dashing right into the darkness. In the moment of confusion just now, the control over reverse flow control had waned, making the creature regain dominion over its body. He stretched his arm towards it and prepared to cast another spell. Just then, his intuition warned him of another attack. He jumped to the side, narrowly avoiding a kick aimed at his back. He turned to the princess with a pissed smile. Are you actually insane? He asked. Dorsey huffed. Let's go, lizard. We'll make do with hunting it like this. 5 minutes. She yelled and ran into the darkness behind it. Wait. That's not fair. Anak yelled in frustration, dashing behind her. Winston and Shibisu stood still for a split second. Unsure of what had just transpired, they looked at each other. The princesses ruined it again. Shibisu lamented. Indeed they did. Winston shook his head. Then, the Shinsu around him moved and reinforced his legs. At the same time, he activated his spirit vision and dashed into the darkness. Whoosh! Boom! An explosion of air rang behind him as cracks spread out from the ground in the form of spider webs. Wait for me! He heard Shibisu yelled from the back. However, he wasn't keen on waiting. As he ran, one thought clouded his mind. Something's wrong. Why did I provoke her without reason? He looked on with the help of his night vision and spirit vision. Is the bull able to influence thoughts and emotions, turning people rash? Or is it something else? As he ran, he prayed that it was the bull that had messed with his thought process and not something else. Hee 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 hee. A low chuckle rang out in the cave. A rice ball like being sat atop a rock, a burger packet and a drink box scattered at its feet. They took the bait successfully. Though I almost thought I would need to do something extensive. The rice ball, the rancor teacher of the wave controllers, shook his head. Then, his smile opened up a bit, revealing 2 pale dots shining in the darkness inside. Let us commence the clean-up, he bellowed. Chapter 37. Submerged Fish Hunt 3. Anak ran through the dark cave, looking around frantically in an attempt to find where the bull and Dorsey had ventured. That little jerk! She yelled, using Shinsu to strengthen her legs and sped up her search. Her figure rapidly blitzed through the cave, leaving a slight whistling sound as she passed. Hundreds of meters of distance was passed in the matter of a few dozen seconds. Anak huffed in annoyance. I need to find the bull before she does. Or she might have already found it. She clicked her teeth, jumping across different pillars, avoiding diving into the water. I would use Shinsu sensing, but the bull is likely traveling through the water, making it hard for me to detect it. Just as she jumped towards another pillar, a small light flashed by her eyes. Sheeing. Anak turned her head on instinct, finding a lone light, like a will-o-wisp dancing in the air, surrounded by darkness. She smirked and summoned a hook from her real inventory. Found you! She yelled, throwing the hook towards the light. Whoosh! The hook dashed through the air with frightening speed. However, it narrowly missed the small light that moved to avoid the attack. The light proceeded to jump across the pillars, getting further away from the attacker. Anak quickly followed. Damn it! Stop running away! She exclaimed. After some time of empty chase, the light eventually disappeared from her vision as she landed on a stone platform that extended further into the cave, no longer surrounded by water. Anak looked around, using her Shinsu sensing to look through the area. However, finding nothing, she shook her head. Just as she was about to jump off again into the dark, a voice called out. What are you looking for? Ms. Anak Jihad. The voice called out. Anak's eyes widened as she turned around. In the darkness, a dim light emerged, and with it a guttural growl too. Something slithered around in the air, something large and shaped like a snake. Then, two dead, cold and unfeeling eyes gazed at her from above. Seethee. A strange sound was produced by this large creature. The creature was indeed like a large snake, the only clear difference being its head, which was like that of a crocodile. Its golden scales shimmered in the dim lighting, making it appear all the more menacing. Slowly, footsteps began to echo around it, and a white object, shaped like a rectangular rice ball, emerged under the creature. Your. Anak's eyes widened just a tiny bit. Hee hee. Surprised to see me? The rancor chuckled. Shinsu sense can pick up any entities and sense the environment with ease. However, for a wave controller rancor, deceiving the senses through false Shinsu input is a piece of cake. I can't imagine any regulars below B rank doing it though. The rice ball droned. Anak looked at him for a moment before shaking her head. Humph. I thought you were the bull. She turned back, intending to jump off the platform and resume her search. Wait. The rancor yelled from the back. Anak turned with a scowl on her face, her anger and annoyance visible through her expression. What? I'm busy. Get lost. Hearing her words, the rice ball shook its head. A shame you're in a hurry. I felt that we could bond, you know? You do resemble your mother. When she died in front of my eyes. Hee hee. The rice ball said crookedly. At that moment, Anak's pupils shrunk into needles, an expression of disbelief and confusion marring her face. What? She managed to squeeze out. What, did you say? The rice ball chuckled in response. Hee hee. Now, let's not get too far without proper introductions. I'll go first. The smirk on the rice ball seemed to get all the more wider as it spoke. I'm a member of the Royal Enforcement Division, Unit number 67. My name is Ren. The rice ball chuckled again at the end. Then, its mouth opened up slightly to reveal a small pendant. It was a small sphere, emerald in color. One of your enemies, Ren said. The pendant flew out of his mouth, somehow floating beside him without falling. Where? Anak said as her eyes remained riveted to the necklace he had just pulled out. Did you get that necklace? She asked. Hee hee. Did you not hear me? It was me. Ren declared. I was the one that killed your mother. The necklace flew back towards his mouth. A red tongue poked out and held the necklace, pulling it back inside. You want this, don't you? Come and get it. Anak's eyes held a crazed look. She summoned her armed inventory and pulled out the green April through it, placing the other hook back inside. Give it back. She yelled. The green April immediately extended as she slammed it right towards Ren. However, instead of impacting him, a low clank of metal rang out. Anak's eyes widened as a larger version of the rice ball. This one with a gigantic red eye at the place of its smile came out from the darkness. Besides, it floated a claw-like appendage, orange in color. This is my favorite pet. Though I enhanced him a bit too much, so he's a bit dangerous. Anak clicked her tongue as the claw beside the creature shot out with a large concentrated bong of Shinsu. Boom! An explosion happened, and with it, the entire area behind Anak was obliterated. Anak, who had dodged the attack at the last moment, looked back and then towards the creature. Then she yelled. Green April. Ignition. Shaya! The Shinsu in the environment surged with a strange power as the weapon in her hands roared out with strength. The weapon tore through the air and right towards the creature, hitting it square in the face. Boom! Crash! The attack uprooted the ground, throwing around the rocks and debris and kicking up dust. How's that? She asked, a crazed smile on her face. That was good, but... Ren droned. Just then, Anak felt her hair stand on end. Hurriedly she jumped forward, avoiding a claw attack from the creature that now stood behind her. Even an attack from the green April's ignition is ineffective. Just then, something clicked. Anak looked down to find a needle sticking out of the left part of her chest. She threw up some blood from her mouth as the needle pulled back. Another one of the same creature, both connected by a chain, floated in the air. Ren came forward and scooped up the green April without a care in the world. Now, it wouldn't be fun to just kill you. So let's make this interesting. Ren yelled, and from the darkness, a familiar figure emerged. Anak's eyes widened as she took in the image. There it stood, the bull in all its glory. Standing on its hind legs, it towered at a staggering 7 meters in height. In its tail, it held a peculiar figure with short brown hair and an orange dress. It was in Dorsey. Hee hee hee. Ren's low chuckle echoed through the darkness. Winston ran through the cave, jumping from one pillar to the other. As he did, the strange feeling in his chest began to amplify, making him feel a bit breathless. The premonition of danger he got from his intuition was unlike anything he had experienced until now, making him realize the severity of the situation. This can't be just the work of the bull. This is something else. He clicked his tongue, not liking the situation that had arose because of his negligence. He had already figured out the way to go using his needle and divination, however, the question remained. Should he continue? He jumped atop a pillar and stopped. His smile had already receded into a small smirk, no longer appearing as prominent. He scratched his head, his expression one of inner conflict. Why do I hesitate? He wondered. Heh, if it were the teenage me, I wouldn't have hesitated to dive headfirst into danger, like a blockhead. He gave a deprecating sigh, chuckling as he did so. He looked towards the ceiling and sighed again, purposefully delaying making a decision. Shaking his head, he opened his real inventory and took out what seemed to be a collection of bells, something he had bought from the Evankel store. As he held them with him, the bells suddenly began to ring with a soft chime. He jumped ahead towards another pillar. The chiming of the bells amplified, now sounding the slightest bit more urgent. He again held the look of contemplation. Eventually he sighed again, and took out a coin. Ding! The coin flipped up with a metallic click, spinning around in the air and landing right onto Winston's hand. He stared at the result of the divination for a moment. His eyes glazed over just a tiny bit. Shibisu ran through the darkness, his breathing rushed and forceful. He stopped for a moment, supporting his body with his knees. Huff, huff, huff. He shook his head. Those monsters. There's no way I can keep up. He yelled, offering an excuse to no one but himself. He stared at the pocket and called out. Kun, what's the situation up there? He asked. The dogs have already encountered the thieves and the spear-bearers have started their assault. There was some trouble for a moment, but that's all resolved. What about the bull? Did you find it yet? Kun asked from the other side. Shibisu shook his head with an annoyed click of his tongue. No. They've really run off somewhere. They're even out of range for my observers. I can't find them. He huffed. On the other side, he heard Kun sigh for a moment. All right then. Do this dash. Just then, the connection was abruptly cut off. Shibisu stared at his pocket for some time, hoping for a continuation of his words. Kun? Hey Kun! He called out. No answer. He held his head and sat down on the ground, feeling all the more annoyed. Just what the hell is happening? He yelled out into the darkness. Just then, he trembled. Quickly standing up, he adopted a combat stance, looking over into the darkness. His body trembled incessantly, refusing to listen to his commands as his senses were pushed into overdrive. This pressure. This absurd pressure. It feels as if my body is about to break apart. He yelled in his mind. What is this? Just then, a sudden voice rang out. Hey, you fashion terrorist. A feminine voice said. And with that, Shibisu's eyes met two shining dots in the dark, gleaming with a baleful red light. I'm gonna have to ask you for directions. Chapter 38. Submerged Fish Hunt, 4. Winston walked through the darkness, his destination unknown for the most part. His legs, boosted through Shinsu, carried him effortlessly through the damp and watery cave. He jumped from one pillar to the other. Jumping onto a rather broad pillar, he stopped and took out a standard red needle, and to do with that, he took out one of Indorsi's hairpins. Then, keeping the needle vertically on the ground, he prompted inside his mind. With that, he let go of the needle that stopped falling after tilting a bit to the right. Grabbing the needle, Winston leapt again, going to the right. As he went about his way, he could not help but question his decision again. Suddenly, he shook his head and smiled. Whatever it might be, I'll just have to face it with a smile. He chuckled. Eventually, he saw faint silhouettes in his spirit vision, various colors that ranged from that of glee, fear, calculating, and regret. In truth, there were about 3 people present. Winston raised a brow as he drew in closer. As he did so, he heard a faint chuckle reverberate in the surroundings, along with a gasp of pain. Winston's face contorted a bit as he took in the scenery before him. There he stood, the teacher of the wave controllers, with his foot planted on Anak's throat, who was writhing under him, gasping in pain and for breath. In the left side of her chest was a bloody injury, through which blood leaked out without stop, pooling under her and dripping her clothes in crimson. Some distance from them, amid a large crater in the wall, lied Indorsi with her back pressed to the rocks. She held her side with an expression of pain and discomfort, and gasped for breath too. She looked on towards the spectacle unfolding before her. Her eyes widened to the extreme as she yelled at the rice ball to let the green-skinned lizard go. Winston didn't quite understand the situation in its entirety, but the scenery before him told him one thing, and so did his own intuition. The rice ball was the enemy. And he was dangerous. So very dangerous. Sweat poured from Winston's forehead as he silently waited behind a pillar for a moment, his grip on his needle tightening. The bells that were now tied to his pants did not offer any chimes, because he didn't want to lose the surprise factor, but he knew that he was about to step into a very dangerous situation. The might of a rancor was not to be contended with by a regular on the test floor, and although he stood in the tower as an irregular, he had yet to bloom with his full potential. Winston hesitated for a moment, and then he sprang into action. Whoosh! With a piercing sound of the wind, he strode forward, covering a distance of 50 meters in the blink of an eye. The rice ball abruptly turned its head, but then, it stopped mid-motion. Winston appeared right in front of him, however. The freeze spell lost its effect at the last moment, which led to the rancor narrowly avoiding a needle that threatened to pierce right through its head. Winston felt some annoyance. He had purposefully refrained from using reverse flow control, solely because the fluctuation of Shinsu might have been noticed by the rancor and mess up his surprise attack. However, even casting only the freeze spell, the rancor had managed to break free after only 0.2 seconds. The rice ball rancor stood some distance away now, having moved away from Anak. Winston! Both the princesses exclaimed in unison, their faces lighting up in relief and joy. Winston didn't answer them, only smiling at the rancor. A rancor attacking a regular on the test floor? If news of this gets out, won't your image be rolled into the dust? He chuckled. The rancor, with its perpetual smile, spoke. Winston Heath, right? You're also quite a promising individual. If you could just turn around and leave, I wouldn't mind sparing you. The rancor shook its head. After all, I had some plans for you to join the Lo Pabia family. Winston raised an eyebrow. So you're from the Lo Pabia family? Isn't that even worse for your position and image? He asked. Am I to assume you won't be leaving? The rancor said in some regret. Though, Winston noticed in his spirit vision, an unmistakable emotion. Unparalleled glee, excitement and happiness. Winston's eyes narrowed a bit. Hey! He called out. Tell me one thing. You're not a sadist, are you? The rancor stopped in his movement and mechanically turned his head. What gave you that impression? Just a hunch. Sigh. With a sigh, the rice ball's mouth opened up a bit, and out from it crawled a gigantic snake like Shinhu. Winston adopted a combat stance, as did Dorsey, who had managed to recover some of her strength. Though, from his spirit vision, Winston noticed her bones being badly injured, mainly the ribs. Can you continue with the fight? Winston asked, turning his body slightly to look at Dorsey. The woman in question nodded with a word. Winston stole a glance at Anak, who was desperately trying to get up from the ground. Winston shook his head. Then, he asked the critical question. Where's Green April? He said. He had turned off his spirit vision while observing the scene, solely because the combined aura of the two weapons were too much for him to accurately see anything else. I have it. Dorsey raised a green hook in her hand. And Black March. Dorsey threw something at him, prompting him to catch it. Winston raised a brow as he caught the Black March, its black edge shimmering even in the dark environment. Seeing the rancor not moving and letting them finish their conversation, Winston opened his real inventory. He smiled and took out a pale blue needle, one with a dark blue handle. The needle had various wave patterns embossed on it, making it appear rather unique and intimidating. Faint ripples of Shinsu bounced off the needle as he took it out, tracing a bright blue phantom behind it. Time to dual wield, I suppose, he said and broke out with a vicious grin. Dorsey also took a combative stance, her eyes glued to the rancor. The rice ball rancor in front chuckled with a malevolent tone. The snake-like creature that floated above him looked at them with its baleful eyes that looked to have been summoned straight out of the abyss. The hulking creature offered such an offensive glare of evil and malevolence that it somehow chilled Winston's spine. There was silence for a moment, before everyone moved as if a starting gunshot had been rung. Shaya! Winston dashed straight at the rice ball, Black March in one hand and the needle gifted by Kun, cerulean tied in the other. In just a moment, both of their figures met in the air. Clang! The rough sound of metal rang out as Winston heard someone yell behind him. Green April. Ignition! With that, he felt a giant pressure overtake the surroundings. Immediately, he cast Shinsu strengthening to his legs and jumped out of the way, just in time for a gigantic attack to slam into the ground, taking the rice ball rancor with it. At the exact moment, the great behemoth that loomed silently in the air until now moved with a frightening speed. Hisses! The snake-like creature hissed, dashing right towards Dorsey. Winston's eyes narrowed as he focused his spirituality onto Black March. "Hey lady, mind if I use you for a bit?" he asked, feeling his perception slowing down as he accelerated his thoughts with Shinsu. The response came just as quickly. "Oh my! Saying such a thing to a fair lady? Someone might misunderstand if they overhear this, you know." The voice chuckled. "Go on. I'll lend you my power." The voice continued. Then, without skipping a beat, Winston leaped forward towards the beast, yelling out while doing so. "Black March! Ignition!" he yelled. Immediately, he felt a strange power flow through him, coursing through his entire body and rejuvenating his spirit. The needle in his right hand exploded into a whirlpool of Shinsu, dark black in color that enveloped almost the entirety of his spirit vision. Without any delay and without any time to ponder over the power, Winston thrusted with the needle, right towards the creature's head. Boom! Crash! Shaya! A series of explosions rang out as Winston saw Dorsey leap back, Anak held beneath her arm like a sack of potatoes. Winston landed back onto the ground and looked on into the dust, his spirit vision seeing through the dust. As of right now, his spirit vision worked better than it would have normally, solely because of the weapon he held in his hand. The Black March elevated his powers, amplifying them beyond his limits. His spirit vision, which had partially been blocked by the giant presence of the Black March and Green April, now cleared up to better reveal the waves. He could read all the waves all the more better than before. Winston broke out with a maniacal grin, looking at the two figures in the dust that were relatively unharmed. Well, at least the rancor was. Two figures emerged, one shorter than a normal human, the other a giant snake. The rice ball was unharmed for the most part, with the only real damage done being the dirt marring its surface. As for the snake, drip, drip, hiss. The snake hissed with a gaping hole in its head, leaking blood incessantly that pooled onto the ground. The blood was a sickly purple color, staining the ground in a strange hue. Winston smiled, satisfied at the power the Black March could display when ignited. My, that's pretty dangerous. The rice ball shook its head. Then, it opened its mouth and the snake was sucked back into its maw. Winston raised a brow. "Afraid that your little pet will die?" he asked with a mocking smile. The rice ball chuckled. The Black March can really display different dimensions of powers in hands of different people. Very well. The rice ball spoke. The grin on its face seemed to get more prominent and widened. Then, a chuckle rang out in the cave. "This is self-defense, you know? You attacked me first." The rice ball yelled. Then, a strange wave traveled through the air. Winston immediately dashed at him, simultaneously casting freeze and reverse flow control. The rancor froze in his act for a split second, his attack stopping in its tracks. Cerulean Tide. Ignition. That's right. The needle Kun had stolen from Kun and Winston's treasury was an ignition weapon. Not only that, it the like that once in the right hand, could pierce even the defenses of a barracuda, or better yet, pierce the shell of a mountain turtle on the 78th floor by itself. A blue wave traveled along the length of the needle, carrying with it an intense force that ran through Winston's body. Without wasting any time, Winston stabbed towards the rice ball, both his ignited weapons simultaneously merging together and working in tandem. Boom! A deafening explosion sounded. Dorsey and Anak covered their ears, wincing at the ear-destroying explosion. The time it took for the rice ball to break out was exactly 0.67 seconds, while Winston had already initiated his attack in 0.5. A direct hit. Winston dashed out from the dust cloud, landing right beside Anak and Dorsey. "Is it done?" Dorsey asked. Winston turned to her with a smile. "You're not supposed to say that," he said. Chapter 39. Submerged Fish Hunt, 5. As Winston's words landed, a giant pressure suddenly descended onto everyone in the cave. Winston suddenly felt his hair stand on edge, his spirit vision seeing the gigantic wave that washed over everything like a tsunami, as if wanting to crush everything in its path. Winston did not feel the pressure, yet the waves that pressed onto his body was enough of an indication as to how much oppression the Shinsu may have caused. If not for him being an irregular, Winston doubted that he could move. He narrowed his eyes as the rice ball rancor walked out of the dust cloud, the perpetual smile still plastered on its face. Mimicking the rancor's costume, Winston also smiled. The condition of the rancor still remained fine for the most part, yet there was a hole in its costume, revealing a giant black void inside through which crimson blood flowed out. He heard the rancor chuckle, and with it, a plethora of colors appeared around him. It was 3 spheres of light that surrounded the rancor. 3 bongs of Shinsu. You're really troublesome, the ranker said, and with that, its mouth opened up for dozens of creatures, Shinhu of various shapes and kinds to crawl out of. Danger! Winston's spiritual intuition went into overdrive as the bells on his pants began to ring uncontrollably, even though Winston was not making use of divination at all. He stole a glance behind him, seeing Dorsey and Anak almost crushed due to the pressure. However, being princesses of Jihad, they could still move. I'm surprised you can still move. I'll just give you one last chance. How about it? Want to join the Lo Pabia family? The ranker's comment accompanied a strange chuckle, bringing a sense of promised pain if Winston dared to refuse. Winston was quiet for a moment. He heard Dorsey struggling behind him, wanting to speak something but ultimately deciding against it. Winston's smile could not help but twitch as he rapidly felt the digestion of his clown potion in such a stressful environment, almost completely having been assimilated. Alas, even if he could digest the potion, there was no way he could attempt a promotion. He weighed his options for a bit. Even if he had both the Black March and the Cerulean Tide and 2 princesses of Jihad, he did not think for a moment he could win against these odds. Well, the ranker pushed for an answer. Black March upon ignition could grievously wound a Shinhu of the ranker. Against dozens, they would be defeated in seconds. And there was also the matter of the ranker himself. The ranker could theoretically make up to 10 bongs, which was the average for a ranker. However, as someone from the wave controller position, Winston would not doubt if he had more than double that amount. Not to mention the Myun and Su contained in each bong transcended each and every bong he could make combined. Sigh. Winston sighed and scratched his head, looking at the ranker who tilted his head at him quizzically. How should I say this? He droned for a moment. How about no? Immediately as his words landed, the ranker attacked without a hint of hesitation. Winston wanted to cast freeze before he could, however, the one of the bongs ran straight through the air and impacted against him. A blow he could barely block by putting Black March before him. Boom! Winston smiled as he was blown off his feet and thrown back through a pillar, wincing slightly in pain. Dorsey and Anak suffered the same fate as the Shinhu rushed upon them without weight. Instantly, Winston felt something inside him breaking down and merging incessantly with his being. As he felt the all-too-familiar and addicting sensation of a full potion digestion, he landed onto the ground and stabilized his body. Without having the time to think of the changes he had due to the potion digestion, he jumped to the right, dodging another bong that smashed onto the place he had stood at just a moment ago. Winston clicked his tongue, rapidly dodging a plethora of attacks from both the ranker and the Shinhu. You're pretty nimble for a regular, not even past the 20th floor. The ranker chuckled. Winston cast freeze and reverse flow control to get out of the encirclement and reach a safe distance, at which point he began to look for the 2 princesses and formulate an escape plan. However, all his hopes were crushed when he saw the 2 princesses enveloped by a snake in a coil. Winston deadpanned at them, wondering why they were so useless. He jumped back and cast another spell, lightly dodging another Shinhu. Having cast bounce onto himself, his jumps were more agile and faster, and along with the spell breeze, the air around him also aided in his movement somewhat. Slowly, a faint mist seemed to overwhelm the area. It started in some areas slowly, however, as Winston dashed across all the areas, the mist covered the cave more and more. The ranker found the particular peculiarity. Utilizing his bongs, he fired them off to take care of the mist, only to see the mist reappearing just a second after. Interesting. Ignite! Winston yelled, piercing right through a Shinhua's head with his needles. At that moment, one of the snakes dashed at him, enveloping him whole in its gigantic maw. Boom! Shah! Winston broke out of its mouth, a shower of blood and gore behind him. He landed only the ground and cast fog once again. The mist seemed almost opaque at this point, appearing pure white in color. Winston's expression shifted slightly, feeling the constant drain on his spirituality at having to maintain the mist despite the ranker dispersing it over and over again. Winston landed again, surrounded by 9 more Shinhu. They're acting more cautious now. Eventually, I'll run out of strength and die. I can't keep up the mist for long, and even if it blocks the Shinhu for now, the ranker remains able to see clearly due to Shinsu sensing. The situation is completely against me. Just when he thought this, he felt another sense of strangeness. He felt something strong heading his way. It was dangerous for sure, but not in the same way he felt the ranker to be. What is this? Winston turned his head one way. The ranker seemingly also noticed the subtle change in the surrounding Shinsu. The Shinsu seemed to offer a strange suppression, the waves going out of control and shaking all over, as if the Shinsu itself was freaking out. Then, a strange red light dashed across the cave, illuminating 2 bright red dots in the distance. Hey, you! The voice called, and with that, the mist dispersed immediately. Winston's eyes widened, seeing the strange suppression the voice itself seemed to carry. He did not replenish the mist again. What do you think you're doing? The feminine voice came again, this time with a slight edge. Those girls you've got tied up over there. They're my sisters. The sound of footsteps echoed in the cave, a slow and deliberate walk. And as the sound came closer, in the dim lighting, a beautiful figure made itself visible. Ha, Yuri Jihad? The rice ball spoke, bafflement in his voice. Winston raised his eyebrows, surprised at the Princess of Jihad and the owner of the Black March arriving here on the test floor, and to rescue them no less. Though he was plenty sure she was only here for collecting the Black March. Behind the princess came a familiar figure dressed in a purple tracksuit. Shibisu. You have a nice sense of direction. Unlike my guide, Yuri said. Hearing her praise, Shibisu smiled. Thank you, princess, he said, his disposition like an obedient butler. The rice ball ranker bowed a bit. My apologies, princess. Let me introduce myself, it said. I am Lo Pa Bia Ren, from the Royal Enforcement Division, Unit Number 67, here to retrieve the Green April and dispose of the enemies of Jihad, he said. Nobody else spoke anything aside from these two as they engaged in a conversation. Red? Yuri asked for confirmation. Ren nodded. That's right. Yuri raised an eyebrow. And why is a member of Red here? What if the test director finds out? I don't remember Red being able to bend the rules of the tower like this, no matter how important of a duty they are on, Yuri declared. Leave right now, before the administrator notices. I'll retrieve both the Black March and the Green April. The ranker was quiet for a moment before he spoke again with a chuckle. Such a pity. It sighed. I had thought that maybe someone like Yuri Jihad would be mature enough to understand the duty of Jihad's forces. It was understandable with Princess Indorsi, who is inexperienced. It shook its head. King Jihad will be very disappointed to hear of this. From the corner of his eyes, Winston saw Indorsi and Anak, who were still in the snake's grasp curse at the ranker. And looking at the ranker, Winston noticed the strange emotions it held, especially the glee it seemed to experience at this moment. He narrowed his eyes. Yuri, hearing the ranker's words, was silent for a moment. But then, an unimaginable pressure descended onto the cave. It was so intense that it felt as if a mini-earthquake had occurred at the space. Winston felt his muscles spasm from the pressure, his body slightly tightening up. It was the first time he had ever felt real pressure from Shinsu. Hey! Yuri's voice rang out, laced with a terrible intent. Her red eyes that glowed with a malevolent crimson light shone down upon the ranker with an unmistakable glare. The name of Jihad is not something to be used so freely, she said. The pressure on the surroundings increased. Threatening a princess of Jihad with the name of Jihad? How foolish. A bit of advice. Don't try this with me. Yuri broke out with a cruel smirk. Or I'll kill you. At that moment, Winston saw Ren's emotions rapidly going through spasms. And then, without any chance for him to react or formulate thoughts, every beast that was around them and in the area suddenly turned rabid, rushing towards Yuri Jihad. Splat. Hey! Red! Came Yuri's voice. Winston blinked, unsure of what he had just witnessed. In the blink of an eye, Yuri had taken care of every single beast that was outside, along with the dozens more that had come out of Ren's mouth. Winston smiled a bit, seeing the power the princess of Jihad held. All over the ground before the princess lied blood of all the creatures. They had not just been killed, they had been turned to mush through a single attack. So this is a high ranker. Just then, Yuri appeared right in front of Ren, nobody even noticing how she had appeared at that place. Then, she extended her hands and made a flicking gesture with her fingers. Now this is self-defense. She smiled. Boom! A deafening explosion rang out, throwing dust everywhere and destroying everything in front of Yuri. Winston stared at this spectacle without a change in expression. It had happened so fast he did not even have time to change expression. Why did you dodge? Yuri spoke. However, it seemed to be more of a warning than a complaint. Come here. Again came her chilling voice. In his eyes, Winston saw the emotions of the ranker going from excitement to fear and confusion, turning a bit chaotic. However, just as he felt that the situation might turn even more in their favor, Yuri stopped. She stared into space for a moment, at which point Winston felt that she was listening to something in her ear. And then, she turned towards him. Hey you! She called out. Winston straightened his back, paying complete attention. Give me the Black March! She yelled. Without a word, Winston threw the Black March over. However, In his mind he heard a distant cry. No. The voice yelled. Alas, he had already thrown the needle. Yuri took the needle from the air and looked at him for a moment. You're somewhat handsome as well. She shook her head and then turned to leave, throwing a pissed glance at Black March. You sexist needle. She cursed. She glanced back at Ren. Do whatever you want, I'm leaving, she said. Winston stared at her in confusion. However, Ren turned to them with a chuckle, not before making a remark about Yuri. This is great, princess. I'll be sure to report to Jihad about this. With that, the ranker turned to them. Winston didn't bother to get into a stance in contrast to Endorsi, Anak, and Shibisu. Instead, he smiled. You're F***ked. He lampooned. With that, Yuri whispered. Do it. At that exact moment, a gigantic pressure came from the ceiling, compressing the shinsu in the air into a tangible plate and crushing the ranker right under it. Crash. Good job. Came Yuri's remark right after. Chapter 40. Submerged Fish Hunt, 6. Silence ensued in the cave for a bit. Winston, Anak, Endorsi, and Shibisu, all of them didn't dare make another sound in front of Yuri. The lady in question turned around again, and with deliberate drawn-out steps, she slowly walked over to the ranker that had been crushed under Shinsu. She smiled. Looks like you're done here. Ren chuckled in response. You're quite cunning, princess. You even brought your crew here. This way, you won't even leave any evidence against you. Hee hee. You might have noticed this as well, princess. But this isn't my main body. The body of the ranker had been thoroughly crushed into a pulp. Red blood pooled around him, dyeing his rice ball suit with a thick shade of red. The ranker coughed. Though that's not to say I've lost. Suddenly, Winston had a bad premonition. The bull. The ranker squeezed out. Winston's eyes widened, and so did everyone else's. Bam! Endorsi yelled in alarm while Yuri clicked her tongue in annoyance. Ren laughed and said, I do apologize, princess. But that irregular is too dangerous for the tower. All irregulars have always brought chaos to the tower. Yuri turned around with a scowl. Damn it! She cursed as the ranker quieted down, this time for good. Shibisu turned to Winston. Winston, can you dive into the Shinshu to help them? He asked. Winston stared at him as if he were an idiot. Are you retarded? The Shinsu pressure in there is too large. I would sink right down to the bottom. He replied with an annoyed expression. Shibisu's expression turned dumbfounded. Oh, right. Sorry, he said. Suddenly, Yuri yelled out. That's it, Evan. Her voice boomed. I'll tear this entire floor apart, she whispered, her soft words traveling all across the air. Winston felt a chill travel up his spine as he watched on. Suddenly, Yuri quieted down again and stared off into space for a moment, as if listening to something. Then, she shook her head in resignation. Hey, regulars, she said. All of them straightened up unconsciously, except for Winston, who held transcendental control over his body. The test is held by the administrator, so I can't provide any help. Sort something out. She shook her head and walked over towards Anak and Endorsi. Then, she genuflected and took the green April that was in Endorsi's hand. This is too heavy for you still, she said. Anak, who had stayed quiet until now due to excessive blood loss, widened her eyes and screamed in retaliation. When you've become a ranker, come and find me. I'll give this to you then. Yuri smiled and stood up. Anak continued to yell back at her, despite being stopped by Shibisu and Endorsi. Stopping just before stepping into the darkness, Yuri looked back and threw something towards Shibisu. Hey, fashion terrorist. Here. Shibisu caught the small object, which was in actuality a metallic wing. This? Shibisu's eyes widened. Wool Hake Song. Winston mused in surprise. Tell him Urek Mazzino is waiting for him on the 77th floor. She smiled. If he survives, of course. She sighed. Just then, Endorsi, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. He will survive, she said. Yuri raised an eyebrow, as did Winston. Why are you so sure? Winston asked. Endorsi only smiled in response and said, I promised I'll date him if he comes back alive. I won't let him miss that opportunity. She chuckled. You're gutsy. Winston chuckled. Without another word, Yuri disappeared into the dark, not even getting caught in Winston's night vision or spirit vision. Bam and Rachel floated along the net made by the goby dolphins, their bubble heading up towards the queen's mouth. Bam stared off into the abyss of water down below, his eyes glazed over still. That feeling, it's getting stronger the more time I spend here. It feels as if a wave is flowing into me from somewhere. Bam contemplated, opening and closing his fist, feeling the power that coursed through his body, relishing in it almost. Rachel quietly gazed at his back from the corner of her eye, looking from the side of the bed she was on. Suddenly, Bam shook his head and broke out of his stupor. He looked above towards the Gobi Queen. "Rachel, we are about to arrive at the Queen's mouth," he said cheerfully. Rachel smiled and nodded in response. "You've changed, Bam." She chuckled. Bam smiled. "Well, I take a bath regularly now. I have many friends and have learned to use shinsu." He broke out with a toothy grin. Rachel looked behind her, her face devoid of expression. "I've also gotten some muscle." Bam flexed his arm, chuckling as he did so. Rachel smiled. "But you still need help from others. You haven't changed all that much. You still can't do anything without me." She laughed. "What? That's not true," Bam exclaimed. Then, he began laughing along with her. "How are your legs now?" he asked. Rachel looked down at her legs in melancholy. "They don't pain anymore, but I still can't move them." She shook her head in regret. "Don't worry, Rachel. I will take you to the top." Bam yelled to console her. Rachel smiled at him. And just as she was about to acknowledge his words, something dashed out from the abyss. Crash! The bubble shook apart, as if a gigantic force had rammed into his, almost tearing it apart. Bam almost lost his balance but stabilized himself. He looked over towards the perpetrator of the act. It was a large creature, with 4 limbs and a tail, its maw vertical with one large eye that shone red. Its back held large flipper-like organs, which in the water looked no different than large, tenebrous wings, dark red in color. "The bull!" Bam exclaimed in terror. "How did it even reach here?" He thought, his mind in a jumbled mess. As he took in the vision of the bull turning around to dash it then again, his mind suddenly underwent a cold and unfeeling clarity, turning tranquil. "It doesn't matter how it got here. I need to protect us," Bam thought with a grim determination. The bull blitzed through the waters, the shinsu bending around it in a way that propelled it forward like a bullet out of a gun. Its streamlined shape when swimming, along with the wings that seemed to take apart the shinsu around it, made its speed in water all the more frightening. Bam extended his hand, immediately casting reverse flow control. "Quiet!" The bull stilled in the water, its maw spread about, just 3 meters away from the bubble. Sweat poured out of Bam's skin. His legs shook a bit from nervousness and stress. Rachel's pupils shook, shrinking uncontrollably in fear. She did not say anything, fearful of making the boy lose concentration. "I need to attack," Bam thought, and without missing a beat, he extended his right hand and tried to use another bong. Crash! Sha! The bull scraped the bubble, dashing forward as the bubble exploded from one side, cracks spreading on its side. "Arg!" Bam exclaimed in pain, clutching his hand which bled in red. A giant gash spread across his hand, making blood drip out from it. "Bam! Are you okay?" Rachel asked from behind him. Bam gnashed his teeth in pain. I'm okay," Bam managed to squeeze out. Rachel looked over in worry. Bam stood up without another word and gazed at the bull that traveled towards them. I need to do this," he thought. Then, extending his hand, the bull stopped. Once again, 3 meters from the bubble. Huff huff. Bam huffed, sweat pouring incessantly from his forehead. He glittered his teeth and concentrated. Roar. The bull roared as the reverse flow control was thrown slightly off its body. And then, a bright ray of light flashed across the water. Sha-ya-ya. Shing. Boom. A flash of light, and with it, the bull fell down into the abyss below, disappearing into the darkness. Bam genuflected, breathing heavily. "Bam. Are you okay?" "Talk to me," Rachel yelled from behind. Hearing her words, Bam managed to smile through. "It's fine," he said. "The bull. I took care of it." He laughed. Then, he turned back and extended his bloodied hand to Rachel as the bubble slowly extended up towards the Queen's mouth. "Rachel, let me be your legs. I will take you to see the stars." He huffed. Rachel looked at him for a moment, and then she smiled. A smile that reflected off from Bam's eyes, a smile that he would give anything in the world for. He smiled in response. Then, as Rachel extended her hands to take his, Shove. Bam blurted out as his feet lost their footing. Rachel stood on her legs, her arms in a pushing motion. Rachel. Sorry, Bam. But you should stay here. The bubble went up above to the light, while the boy fell down into the darkness. Anak finally quieted down and laid onto the floor, staring at the ceiling with empty eyes. Everyone ignored her. There was silence for a moment as everyone sat down on the ground, getting a moment of relief. Well, that was dangerous, Winston exclaimed. Shibisu chuckled. You can say that again. Dorsey turned her head to look over and asked, How did you find us so fast? I thought we avoided you quite nicely. Winston shook his head. Not nicely enough, apparently. Be thankful for that, though. It saved your life. He chuckled. Ha! We were doing just fine. Dorsey snorted. Shibisu shook his head. Your condition suggests otherwise. Bam! And just like that he was booked on the head. Even still, I never expected a teacher to be a member of Red, Shibisu said, rubbing his head. Me too. Winston smiled. I felt something was wrong. Almost made me not come here and stay at a safe distance. Dorsey and Shibisu raised an eyebrow. Winston explained, I have good intuition. It works as some sort of danger sense. He laughed. So I made a gamble and flipped a coin. Sigh. And here I thought you fell for me and came to save me like a knight in shining armor. Don't misunderstand. The result was a tails. Winston held a smug look on his face. Dorsey and Shibisu raised an eyebrow. Then why made you choose coming here? Shibisu asked. Winston smiled enigmatically. Who knows? He said. Dorsey and Shibisu looked at him for a moment before they both smiled. Thank you. Dorsey whispered silently. However, in the quiet environment, everyone heard it. Winston wanted to make her repeat that somehow, but he decided against ruining the moment. What was that? I didn't hear you. Never mind that. Dorsey turned her head with a smile. It's best not to make a princess repeat her words. Winston. Shibisu suddenly yelled. Yes. Please let me call you my son. He yelled again. No way in hell. Pfft. A low laugh came out of Anak's mouth, who lied some distance away from them. Then Shibisu too chuckled, and then Winston too along with them. Dorsey stared at them for a moment before she too began to laugh. Winston's laughter was contagious, eventually overtaking them all. All of them shared a small moment of repose and friendship, a quiet instance that would soon become inconsequential. However, none of them cared for what would come next. Neither did they bother to think about it. They just laughed. They laughed at the strange plays of fate. They laughed at their own moment of joy. They laughed, a smile on each of their faces. It was a happy smile, an exaggerated smile, a ridiculous smile.